The story begins inside an inn, where Gale Hamilton is busy writing down ideas on how to improve his party. Suddenly, the party leader calls him over and apologizes before informing him that his contract is being terminated. Gale is caught completely off guard as the leader announces that, effective immediately, he has been expelled from the wolf pack. The party gathers around a table while Gale scratches his head in confusion. Kush Bilbor, the party's paladin and leader, bluntly informs him that he has been fired. Before Gale can fully process what is happening, Melissa, the party's light fighter, laughs at him and mocks him, while Luke, the party's thief, attempts to stop her. Norris, the black mage, sarcastically remarks that Gale should have expected this day to come. Unable to understand the sudden decision, Gale stands and asks everyone to give him a moment, because the dismissal seems completely unexpected. Kush questions how Gale could possibly think it came out of nowhere. Reflecting on the past 3 years, Gale remembers how he had crafted cursed items for the party ever since they were a low-ranked group. Despite that, he honestly admits that he still does not understand why he is being dismissed. Kush ridicules him for being so slow to realize the obvious. He explains that Gale's profession as a curse crafter is considered one of the worst support jobs imaginable. According to him, all Gale can do is weaken monsters with disposable cursed items, making him unnecessary for an S-rank party. He also points out that Gale is the lowest level member of the group, having remained stuck at level 31. Gale tries to defend himself. Although he admits that curse crafting is not a popular profession, he reminds everyone that his cursed items have allowed the party to complete countless quests with ease. His curses are intentionally kept mild enough to be removed safely by priests or talismans, and many of his creations are permanent passive items rather than simple consumables. To demonstrate this, he presents a cursed necklace designed to affect monsters passively. Instead of appreciating it, the others react with disgust, criticizing him for even carrying such an item and questioning his judgment. Kush then reveals that the party has already found a replacement. Since they have reached S rank, they no longer need Gale's cursed equipment. Their new member is Moria Glaris, a support mage who has mastered both buffing and debuffing magic. As Moria arrives, the party warmly welcomes her. Gale quietly notices how beautiful she is. Kush makes it clear that Gale is no longer needed. As Gale turns away, he overhears the others whispering that low-level members only drag down S-rank parties and that this outcome was inevitable. Desperate, Gale turns back and asks for one final chance. He explains that he had avoided introducing too many new ideas because he did not want to disrupt the party, but he has created many powerful cursed items they have never even tested. No one responds. Kush simply stares back at him while tears begin filling Gale's eyes. Gale asks if they are absolutely certain they will not regret this decision. Kush confidently assures him that they will not. Gale reflects on everything they have shared over the years. Although he was never capable of flashy combat techniques, he had always been proud to support the party through every quest. He genuinely believed he would remain with the wolf pack forever. Instead, Kush advises him to quit adventuring entirely and open a cursed item shop instead. Melissa jokes that such a business would probably attract only strange customers. Norris adds that he would gladly advertise the shop just to show everyone the bizarre curse crafter behind it. Luke quietly admits that he never personally held any grudge against Gale. Realizing there is nothing left to say, Gale accepts the decision, thanks everyone for the years they worked together, and walks away. While walking through the inn's hallway, Gale struggles to understand how the people he spent 3 years with could cast him aside so easily. He recalls Kush informing him that his lodging expenses would only be covered until he left, and that the expensive curse materials Gale had purchased would not be returned. After thinking about everything, Gale realizes he had practically been working for free. Frustrated, he curses his terrible situation. Looking back, he notices the rest of the party laughing together. Standing near the exit, Gale decides to undo one final secret. He takes out a paper-like catalyst and silently casts a powerful dispel spell. Unknown to the others, he had secretly attached cursed items to their equipment long ago. Those cursed items continuously enhance their natural abilities. Since they no longer wanted his support, he decides to remove every one of those enchantments. As the spell activates, a glowing magic circle appears. The recoil immediately strikes Gale, causing intense pain throughout his body before he collapses onto the floor, gasping for breath. Most cursed equipment binds its negative effects directly to its wearer in exchange for increased abilities. However, the cursed equipment Gale crafted worked differently. While it increased the party's overall strength, it also imposed penalties such as reduced experience gain and minor status ailments. Instead of forcing those penalties onto his teammates, Gale had transferred every negative effect onto himself, silently carrying the burden alone so that the rest of the party could become stronger. After recovering slightly, Gale realizes the recoil is painful, but also notices that his own body suddenly feels much lighter. Since the curses have now been removed, Kush and the others have lost all of the hidden enhancements they had unknowingly relied upon. Gale no longer cares because the party now has a new support mage. Since the rest of the party members are all around level 50, Gale had previously been carrying roughly 20% of each member's curse penalties himself. Once the burdens disappear, his own strength increases dramatically. Checking his status, he discovers that he has jumped from level 31 to level 48. Gale Hamilton. Job, Curse Crafter. Stamina, 1311 Strength, 980 Defense, 1024 Magic, 3402 Agility, 835 Resistance, 4509 Remaining Status Points, plus 875 Curse Item Slots. 8. For comparison, Kush, despite being a paladin, possesses around 5,000 Strength and 3,000 Defense, placing Gale's support-focused abilities at an unexpectedly high level. A female employee approaches and politely asks Gale to leave the inn now that he has checked out. He apologizes and quietly exits. Outside, he stretches and begins wondering what to do next. Although completely broke, he still possesses every cursed item he personally created. Looking ahead, he notices a merchant enthusiastically attracting customers to a small market stall. The sight reminds him of Kush's mocking suggestion about opening a cursed item shop. Ironically, Gale realizes that owning his own shop has always been one of his dreams. He imagines opening a small tool shop somewhere in the countryside where he could wake up whenever he wanted, eat whenever he wanted, create whatever cursed items interested him, and freely conduct all the research he desired. For the first time since being expelled, he begins feeling excited about the future. Deciding to earn enough money for his travels, Gale resolves to open a small stall of his own. Meanwhile, back at the Silver Wolf Inn, the rest of the wolf pack enjoys a meal together. Kush remarks that he already feels much better without Gale around. Norris agrees, believing the party had spoiled Gale for far too long simply because he had been one of the original members. In their opinion, replacing him should have happened much earlier. Moria quietly listens without joining the conversation. The others apologize for discussing Gale in front of her. Kush explains that he and Gale had known each other ever since the party was first created, making the decision somewhat difficult. He casually mentions that Gale often attached strange lucky charms and mysterious accessories to their equipment. Suddenly, every piece of equipment worn by the party begins glowing. Everyone freezes in shock. Recognizing the magical phenomenon, Moria immediately realizes that it resembles an extremely powerful dispel spell. The others cannot understand what has happened. Norris notices that his magic power suddenly feels weaker, while Luke comments that his own body feels strangely heavier. Moria is equally surprised by what she witnesses. She realizes that such a powerful dispel affecting every party member simultaneously is extremely unusual. At first, the others suspect Gale may have retaliated against them after being expelled. Luke even regrets not eliminating him before he left. Moria, however, reaches a completely different conclusion. If Gale had attacked them with a curse, the result would make sense. However, a dispel spell should not weaken people unless it is removing beneficial magic. For a dispel to reduce every party member's abilities simultaneously, it would mean that Gale himself had previously maintained the enhancements that strengthened them. She cannot believe he intended to harm anyone. Kush dismisses the entire matter, insisting that Gale is no threat to the party. Melissa confidently agrees, believing they could easily defeat him if he ever caused trouble. Moria attempts to explain that what they experienced was not an attack, but simply a dispel spell. Before she can finish, Kush cuts her off and reminds everyone that he is the party leader. According to him, if he declares Gale an enemy, then Gale is the party's enemy. He warns Moria that she should quickly learn how the wolf pack operates. Norris boasts that the next time they encounter Gale, he will simply incinerate him with magic. Luke teases Norris about his weakened magic, questioning whether he could still accomplish that. Norris dismisses the concern as mere imagination. Luke jokes that seeing Gale reduced to begging on the streets would be entertaining and even suggests cutting off Gale's fingers to prevent him from crafting cursed items ever again. Norris laughs and doubts Luke possesses enough precision to do such a thing. The argument gradually turns into playful bickering. Melissa comments that they have all stooped surprisingly low. Kush tells her to ignore the argument. Meanwhile, Moria continues thinking. She clearly felt everyone's abilities decrease the instant the spell activated. It was almost as though the entire party had unknowingly been receiving a permanent enhancement all along. Although she briefly wonders if she is imagining things, she cannot ignore the evidence. Melissa eventually approaches her, notices her troubled expression, and offers her a drink. Moria accepts, but continues thinking. Ordinary curse crafters are incapable of creating cursed items that permanently strengthen allies in this manner. If someone truly possessed such an ability, they would be the first known curse crafter capable of doing so. The possibility continues bothering her. As the others continue arguing, Moria quietly wonders whether the wolf pack still deserves its S-rank status if someone as extraordinary as Gale has just left the party. Outside, Gale is no longer affiliated with the wolf pack. Inside the inn, Kush insists that Gale no longer matters. The party now focuses entirely on tomorrow, when they will undertake their very first official S-rank quest. Everyone eagerly celebrates the opportunity to prove their strength. Their mission is to defeat a behemoth, a disaster-class monster, and they are completely convinced that victory will be effortless. Moria, however, cannot shake the feeling that the party has made a terrible mistake. She still has no idea what their former curse crafter was truly capable of or how much of the wolf pack's strength had actually depended on him. She quietly finishes her drink while remaining lost in thought. Elsewhere, Gale can be heard chasing after a bird, desperately trying to retrieve the necklace it had stolen. Before opening his own business, Gale Hamilton visits the Pumpkin Seed Merchants Guild to register as a vendor. Hoping to secure a stall in the busy central square of the capital, he learns that the location costs 4 gold coins per day. After checking his remaining savings and realizing he only has 3 silver coins left, he settles for a much cheaper stall located along the road leading to the square. After moving all of his belongings to the small stall, Gale remarks that although it is not in the best condition, it is more than enough for his needs. A guild employee kindly provides him with a used starter stall kit, which Gale gratefully accepts. As he begins arranging his cursed items and decorative goods, he wonders how much he should charge for them. His only goal is to recover the cost of the materials he spent crafting them. While organizing his merchandise, the same employee returns after realizing he forgot to explain how products should be displayed. He quickly rearranges the entire stall, making everything far more organized and easier for customers to browse. Gale is amazed by the improvement and sincerely thanks him once again. Before leaving, the employee reminds him that every merchant has their own selling style, but if customers cannot easily find the merchandise, they simply will not buy anything. The employee then returns to his duties, leaving Gale deeply touched by such unexpected kindness. After everything he had experienced with Kush and the rest of the wolf pack, even this small act of generosity moves him to tears. Looking at one of his favorite cursed necklaces tucked inside his shirt, Gale reluctantly decides to place it on display as well. Although he is attached to it, his financial situation leaves him little choice. Standing behind a stall for the first time, Gale feels extremely nervous. He wonders whether the people of the capital will accept cursed items at all or reject them simply because of their reputation. Gathering his courage, he calls out to passing adventurers and advertises his wide selection of debuff items and cursed equipment at bargain prices. The first customers approach with curiosity. Some are surprised to see talismans being sold so cheaply, while others question whether cursed items could ever compete with ordinary support magic. Gale carefully explains that although cursed items are often considered inferior to support mages and are frequently single-use, they possess important advantages. Anyone can use them regardless of magical ability, and they require no mana to activate. He also explains that many of his talismans are inexpensive because he crafts them from monster materials and homemade compounds, meaning customers are mostly paying for his labor rather than rare ingredients. As interest grows, Gale introduces various products, including talismans capable of inflicting poison, status ailments, and temporary stat changes. One customer becomes interested in a cursed short sword. Gale explains that equipping it slightly lowers the user's agility, while granting an anti-armor effect against monsters. In addition, every other stat receives a 10% increase. He also openly mentions that the weapon is cursed. The customer is so startled by that revelation that he immediately drops the sword. Rather than hiding the truth, Gale honestly explains every curse attached to each item. Realizing that not everyone wishes to fight with cursed equipment, he even suggests using the weapon purely as decoration because of its striking appearance. The customer eventually purchases it for that very reason, believing it might ward off evil spirits at home. To ensure the customer encounters no problems, Gale includes 3 dispel talismans free of charge. This becomes the pattern for every sale. Whenever someone purchases cursed equipment, Gale carefully explains every curse, every beneficial effect, and exactly how to remove the curse safely afterward. He freely includes multiple dispel talismans with every purchase. Among the merchandise is a cursed necklace that increases every stat by 50%, a pair of cursed boots that multiply agility by 2.5 times, and a cursed crossbow that raises all stats by 30%, while granting perfect accuracy through the sure shot effect. Every customer also receives several dispel talismans to safely remove the curses whenever desired. As more adventurers arrive, Gale continues patiently explaining each item's effects rather than hiding the risks. His honesty earns the customer's trust, At one point, someone asks about cursed equipment in general. Gale recalls an old legend about a famous hero whose closest companion was a berserker known for collecting cursed equipment, including a legendary suit of cursed armor. He explains that although many people instinctively fear cursed items, properly understanding both their risks and benefits reveals how useful they can truly be. His willingness to fully explain each curse and provide free dispel talismans makes his products far more appealing. Word spreads rapidly throughout the marketplace. Adventurers begin telling one another that the mysterious merchant not only sells unusually powerful cursed equipment, but also includes free dispel talismans with every purchase. Since dispel talismans are both rare and expensive, this unexpected bonus attracts even more customers. Before long, Gale completely sells out every item in his stall. Looking at his nearly empty bag, he realizes how light it has become. He remembers the many different customers who visited throughout the day, including one who joked that his merchandise looked incredibly intimidating, especially one particularly frightening item. Just as he begins relaxing after finishing business, another group of adventurers rushes over after hearing rumors about the free dispel talismans. Unfortunately, Gale has already sold everything. The disappointed adventurers ask whether they can bring their own equipment for him to curse while also receiving dispel talismans. After agreeing to return the following day, Gale quickly leaves the marketplace. Meanwhile, many of the customers who purchase his merchandise begin testing their new equipment. Some initially hesitate because of the curses attached to the items. One customer nervously equips a cursed ring despite being afraid of cursed objects. The moment he checks his status, he is stunned by the enormous increase in his abilities. Showing his status to his companion, both are astonished that a single ring can legitimately increase every stat by 50%. They can hardly believe such overwhelming effects exist on one piece of equipment. Other customers experience similar surprises after testing their purchases. Many conclude that the incredible stat increases easily outweigh the inconvenience of carrying a curse. Some even joke that they have no intention of removing the equipment at all. Others begin discussing the cost of curse removal. Since churches normally charge enormous fees to perform dispel magic, they realize the free dispel talismans alone possess tremendous value. One adventurer briefly suggests reselling the talismans for profit before another immediately warns him not to say such things publicly, especially if priests are nearby. Even so, everyone agrees that official dispel services cost several gold coins, making Gale's generosity almost unbelievable. As rumors continue spreading, adventurers begin wondering who this cheerful curse crafter actually is. Many become convinced that every guild and adventuring party will soon be searching for him. Some even feel as though they have seen him somewhere before, but cannot remember where. None of them realize the truth. None of the customers know that this seemingly ordinary merchant had willingly accepted the burdens and curses of 4 different people for years in order to strengthen his former party. None of them could imagine that the craftsman responsible for helping raise an adventuring party all the way to S rank had just been expelled and forced to sell his life's work from a modest roadside stall at bargain prices. From that day onward, stories begin circulating about a mysterious curse crafter who appears unexpectedly with astonishing equipment before disappearing just as suddenly, gradually becoming the subject of whispered rumors throughout the kingdom. Meanwhile, Gale happily reflects on the day's success, realizing that even a small amount of money has greatly improved his mood. At the same time, the wolf pack begins its first official S-rank quest deep within a forest. The battle quickly turns disastrous. A tremendous explosion echoes through the forest as a massive tree is split in half. Another violent impact sends Kush flying backward, crashing hard into a tree. The party is shocked that they're struggling so badly despite being an S-rank team. Standing before them is a gigantic ogre whose terrifying roar shakes the forest. No matter how fiercely they fight, the monster refuses to fall, leaving the party overwhelmed as the battle against the disaster-class creature truly begins. The story continues with the wolf pack preparing for their first S-rank quest. Although some members express concern about relying on their newly recruited support mage, Moria Glaris, Kush confidently assures everyone that they will be fine. Having personally recruited her, he believes she is among the finest support mages the guild has to offer. The rest of the party assumes she will quickly adapt to their fighting style, and everyone looks at her with high expectations. Moria simply smiles in response. Before proceeding to their main objective, Kush decides the party should warm up by defeating a nearby monster. They soon encounter an ogre. The battle immediately begins to fall apart. Even Kush starts struggling against the monster. Luke fires an arrow, but his aim is so inaccurate that it nearly strikes Melissa instead of the ogre. Confused by his poor performance, Luke realizes his movements feel strangely off. Melissa initially dismisses the monster as merely an ogre, But before she can react further, the creature knocks both her and Luke into a nearby tree with a powerful swing. Kush turns to Norris, demanding to know why his spell is taking so long to cast. Under pressure, Norris finally completes the incantation, but only a tiny flame appears instead of the powerful magic everyone expected. Kush angrily realizes they have no chance of defeating the monster if this is the best Norris can produce. While berating Norris, Kush fails to notice that the ogre has already moved behind him. Just before the monster attacks, Moria reacts instantly by casting a rescue spell that pulls Kush away from danger. After confirming that he is unharmed, Kush immediately orders Moria to stop wasting time and strengthen the party. Moria explains that she has been continuously casting buffs since the battle began and is already close to exhausting her magic reserves. Determined to help further, she slams her weapon into the ground and unleashes another powerful support spell. Brilliant magical light spreads beneath Kush's feet as his combat abilities are doubled. According to Moria, those enhancements should allow him to defeat even an A-rank monster with little difficulty. Confident once more, Kush charges directly toward the ogre. Instead of being overwhelmed, however, the monster effortlessly catches his sword with one hand, completely blocking the attack. Before Kush can react, the ogre lifts him into the air, using his own weapon, and throws him aside with tremendous force. As the monster advances again, Kush retreats and immediately blames Moria for the party's poor performance. He dismisses her support magic as completely useless and claims that doubling their abilities has accomplished nothing. Moria reminds him that he had originally insisted on conserving their strongest buffs for the upcoming behemoth battle because he believed ordinary monsters would not require them. Since he is dissatisfied with her magic, she decides to use something left behind by Gale instead. Among the belongings Gale secretly prepared before leaving is a written guide explaining the wolf pack's combat style, along with instructions about the support he had always provided in secret. He also left behind several cursed items for Moria to use if necessary. Moria explains that before she joined the party, Gale regularly weakened enemies with cursed debuffs before every battle, making victories much easier. Rather than listening, Kush forcefully shoves her to the ground. Convinced that Gale betrayed them, Kush insists that the magical circles from the previous day were actually curses rather than harmless dispels. Melissa immediately agrees with his conclusion, believing the party is now suffering under one of Gale's curses. Luke claims he suspected Gale from the very beginning. Accepting that explanation, the party decides to abandon the mission for the day while angrily blaming Gale for everything that has gone wrong. Kush reflects that the highway they are traveling is normally filled with dangerous A-rank monsters, but advanced adventurers routinely travel through it without difficulty. As an S-rank party, retreating should never have been necessary. Luke reasons that although everyone is frustrated, continuing to fight while supposedly weakened by Gale's curse would be reckless. Norris refers to the withdrawal as a strategic retreat rather than a defeat. Melissa agrees, noting that the ogre no longer seems interested in chasing them and has apparently grown tired of waiting. Kush finally orders the retreat. Moria is astonished by how quickly the party gives up. She cannot understand why an S-rank team would retreat so easily. Instead of answering her concerns, Kush notices that Moria has suffered fewer injuries than the rest of the group. The others point out that, as the newest member, she hardly participated in the battle compared to everyone else. Because of that, they assign her the dangerous responsibility of guarding the rear while everyone else withdraws. Moria is stunned. As a support mage, she considers such an order completely unreasonable. Nevertheless, Kush thanks her and leaves with the others. The entire wolf pack flees, leaving Moria alone. Once the others disappear, the ogre calmly addresses her. Left alone with the monster, Moria becomes overwhelmed with anger. She crumples Gale's written notes and throws them into the air. As the paper flips through the air, it suddenly activates, releasing an enormous cloud of smoke. Consumed by frustration, Moria rushes forward with murderous determination. Meanwhile, after traveling a considerable distance away, the rest of the wolf pack becomes exhausted. Despite doing little more than running, everyone feels unusually weak and sick, forcing them to stop and rest. Norris realizes that he dropped one of his favorite belongings during their escape. The party reflects on how close they felt to dying despite facing only a single ogre. Kush cannot believe that an S-rank party was humiliated by such a monster. Melissa directs her frustration toward Moria, claiming that the new support mage contributed almost nothing during the battle. Under normal circumstances, the wolf pack would have had no trouble defeating multiple ogres at once. She also notices how strangely exhausted everyone has become after such a short retreat. Kush agrees that something is clearly wrong. Melissa continues blaming Moria for the disaster, criticizing everything about her. The rest of the party quietly ignores those complaints, realizing they have little to do with the actual problem. Norris points out that the issue began even before Moria started casting buffs. Everyone's movements had already become sluggish, and his own magic took nearly twice as long to cast as usual. Luke reminds him how weak that spell turned out to be, while Norris argues that Luke himself would normally have been defeated long before if he had performed that poorly. Unable to explain their condition logically, Kush once again places all the blame on Gale and begins thinking about how to get revenge against him. Eventually, Moria catches up with the retreating party. She arrives exhausted and breathing heavily, her eyes fixed sharply on the others. Kush casually remarks that it took her long enough to escape from the ogre before noticing something large attached to her back. Meanwhile, back in the capital, Gale happily carries the supplies for another day of business. Although he enjoys running his stall, he wishes more ordinary townspeople would become interested in his products instead of only adventurers. While many city residents stop to browse his merchandise, most hesitate to purchase cursed items. Although he successfully sold every piece of cursed equipment, almost all of his customers were adventurers attracted by both the equipment and the free dispel talismans. As Gale considers ways to expand his business, he meets the merchant who previously helped him establish his stall. After learning that business has been going well, the merchant suggests relocating to a different area. The proposed location lies near the Noble District. The merchant explains that ordinary citizens usually prioritize practicality when shopping, whereas wealthy nobles often seek unusual and luxurious decorations that display wealth and sophistication. If nobles begin treating Gale's cursed items as fashionable decorations for their homes, his work could become recognized as cutting-edge design. Such recognition might even lead to commissions for decorating noble estates and castles. The merchant also quietly notes that one particularly unsettling adventurer with bloodshot eyes has recently been lingering around Gale's stall, making relocation seem even wiser. Putting those concerns aside, Gale prepares for another busy day of selling his merchandise. As he finishes setting up his stall once again, he remains completely unaware that a mysterious young woman has been watching him from a distance. The chapter begins with the wolf pack preparing to continue their S-rank quest. Despite the disastrous battle with the ogre, Kush remains confident that everything will work out with Moria as their new support mage. The others also expect her to quickly adapt to the party. As they continue, the ogre that had been pursuing them suddenly appears behind Moria. Earlier, Gale's cursed item had temporarily reduced the monster's strength and size, but once its effect wore off, the ogre returned to its original, full power. Realizing the monster is still chasing them, Moria is horrified. She cannot believe the others expect her to handle it alone and urges them to take over instead. Rather than helping, the party reminds her that she is responsible for guarding the rear. The ogre steadily advances toward the group, causing everyone to panic. Desperate to save themselves, they even attempt to distract the monster by suggesting that Moria would make a better meal than they would. The plan immediately fails. The ogre calmly reveals that it is actually a vegetarian. Terrified, the entire party flees once again. 4 days later, the wolf pack finally returns to civilization in miserable condition. The exhausting escape led them into another forest, where they became hopelessly lost. By the time they arrive at an inn, they are filthy, exhausted, and emit such a terrible odor that everyone nearby instinctively covers their noses. Watching from the counter, Moria quietly acknowledges that the party deserves its miserable condition, especially because they continue blaming Gale for every setback. The others impatiently demand water and towels from the innkeeper, complaining about the poor service. The innkeeper responds by placing a single glass of water on the table while informing them that it is not free. She explains that the party only paid for lodging through the previous day. Unless they can pay for another night, they will have to leave once they finish the water. Kush attempts to intimidate her by reminding her that the wolf pack is an S-rank party. However, when he reaches into his money pouch, he discovers that it is completely empty. Everyone stares at him in disbelief. The reason quickly becomes obvious. During their recent journey, the party had spent enormous amounts of money replacing damaged equipment, purchasing expensive beauty products, buying new weapons, repairing armor, and replacing magical tools destroyed during the battle with the ogre. Kush's custom-made longsword had even been chipped beyond repair. As a result, the wolf pack is completely broke. The innkeeper calmly calculates the cost of another night's stay and food. Faced with the total expense, the entire party falls silent. While everyone hesitates, Melissa becomes so thirsty that she drinks the only glass of water by herself. Meanwhile, Moria quietly orders food and a mug of ale using her own money. The rest of the party immediately notices. They question why she is not contributing her money to the party's shared funds. Moria reminds them that quest rewards are only pooled after completing guild requests. Since this is her personal money, it does not belong to the party. The others casually dismiss her explanation. insisting that everything she owns should belong to the wolf pack. They forcibly take her money pouch. After seeing how much money she has saved, they become impressed by how profitable a skilled support mage can be. Watching them steal her money is the final straw. Moria quietly loses her patience. Kush mocks her, reminding her that support mages possess weak, offensive abilities and could never seriously threaten the party. Before he can finish speaking, Moria punches him directly in the face with tremendous force. The unexpected uppercut knocks Kush completely to the ground. Melissa immediately grabs a chair and swings it at Moria. The attack fails as Moria effortlessly avoids it, leaving only torn clothing behind. Appearing behind Melissa in an instant, Moria strikes her down as well. Luke and Norris attempt to intervene, urging everyone to calm down. Ignoring them, Moria furiously lashes out at the entire party, calling them nothing more than pathetic pretenders. Luke threatens retaliation, but before he and Norris can reach her, a magical circle appears beneath their feet. Moria uses the spell to launch herself upward before landing directly on top of both men. To the amazement of everyone inside the inn, Moria single-handedly defeats the entire wolf pack. After the fight, she calmly wipes the sweat from her forehead and apologizes to the innkeeper for the damage caused during the brawl. The innkeeper jokingly remarks that Moria actually cleaned up the establishment rather than damaging it. With complete confidence, Moria officially announces that she is leaving the wolf pack for good. Meanwhile, Gale continues operating his market stall. A noble-looking woman visits his shop and becomes fascinated by one of his decorative lanterns featuring a basilisk design. Although she mistakes it for a lizard, she praises its unique appearance. Gale happily explains that it is actually a cursed oil lamp. The noble woman immediately becomes frightened upon hearing the word cursed. Her bodyguard quickly steps forward, believing Gale is attempting to sell dangerous cursed objects to a noble. Gale calmly explains that the lamp is intended purely as interior decoration. It possesses a charm effect, but is designed more as an artistic piece than as combat equipment. After hearing the explanation, the nobles become increasingly interested. In fact, they willingly pay even more than Gale originally requested. Although decorative cursed items prove surprisingly popular among wealthy customers, his ordinary combat equipment continues attracting relatively little interest. As evening approaches, Gale prepares to close his stall. Thinking back over the day, he remembers that nearly every noble described his creations as unusual or interesting, yet none openly admitted that they genuinely liked his designs. He begins wondering whether his artistic style is simply too unconventional. While packing up, a young woman approaches his stall and asks whether he is closing. Looking at her clothing, Gale assumes she may belong to the nobility despite her relatively simple appearance. Seeing what appears to be a guard standing nearby reinforces that suspicion. The young woman quietly browses his merchandise before expressing genuine admiration for its unusual style. Rather than finding his designs strange, she sincerely appreciates how different they are. She especially compliments one of his rings, calling it adorable. For the first time, someone openly praises the appearance of his creations instead of merely commenting on their unusual nature. Gale blushes with embarrassment and thanks her for noticing. Believing she has disguised herself to avoid attracting attention, he decides not to treat her with excessive formality. Since he is already closing for the day, he offers her a special discount. The young woman awkwardly explains that she accidentally left her purse elsewhere. After nearly revealing that it was left at the castle, she quickly corrects herself and claims it is back at home. Laughing, Gale tells her that whatever money she has available will be enough because she is the first customer to truly appreciate his designs. He simply asks her not to tell his regular customers about the discount. Smiling, she accepts the offer. Instead of paying a small amount, however, she places a large gold coin into Gale's hand. He is stunned that someone casually carries such valuable currency. Before he can stop her, she happily waves goodbye and leaves. Watching her disappear, Gale cannot help thinking how adorable she is. Moments later, he notices someone watching him with a grim expression, sending a shiver down his spine. Only then does he suddenly remember something important. He completely forgot to explain the ring's curse or provide any dispel talismans. Fortunately, the ring's curse is relatively harmless. The memorial ring triples its wearer's defense and grants immunity to instant death attacks. The only drawback is that, once worn, it cannot be removed until the curse is dispelled. Gale reassures himself that such a wealthy noble should easily be able to visit a church and have the curse removed. He resolves to apologize and give her plenty of dispel talismans if they ever meet again. Then another thought suddenly crosses his mind. She had almost said she lived at the castle. Meanwhile, the mysterious young woman is suddenly surrounded by numerous soldiers. They quickly seize her and drag her into a nearby alley despite her desperate attempts to resist. A supervising woman confirms that they have successfully captured her before ordering the soldiers to return immediately. Later, inside the royal castle, the exhausted soldiers collapse from fatigue after struggling to restrain her. The supervising woman reminds the young lady that she must stop causing trouble because she is none other than Princess Kara. The princess remains visibly dissatisfied. Elsewhere, as Gale walks through the city, someone suddenly pats him on the shoulder. The stranger explains that he is searching for a young man with black hair, wearing a blue jacket, who operates a nearby market stall, perfectly matching Gale's appearance. Curious, the stranger asks to see his face. When Gale turns around, the man becomes uncertain and apologizes before leaving, deciding that Gale does not appear to be as young as the person he is searching for. Once the stranger disappears, Gale quietly enters a hidden alley and casts a disguised dispelling spell on himself. Realizing that the capital's military has apparently been searching for him, Gale becomes alarmed. Convinced that remaining in the capital may soon become dangerous, he decides he should pack up his stall and leave town as quickly as possible. A group of nearby children who witnessed the spell excitedly asks him to perform the magic trick again. Gale immediately signals for them to remain quiet. The chapter begins inside the royal castle, where Vivian scolds Princess Kara for purchasing a cursed ring. She considers the ring offensive to the church itself because of its cursed nature. Princess Kara, however, sees nothing wrong with it. She believes that interacting with ordinary citizens and understanding their interests is part of her responsibility. Vivian looks around the princess's room, which is already filled with unusual decorations and curiosities, and admits that she simply does not share Kara's appreciation for such unconventional designs. Reminding the princess that foreign envoys will soon arrive for an official meeting, Vivian urges her to prepare quickly. Instead of getting dressed, however, Kara is quietly attempting to put on the newly purchased ring. Vivian is horrified when she realizes the princess intends to wear the cursed ring. Kara explains that she only wants to try it on briefly. Meanwhile, Gale enjoys a meal inside the Adventurers Guild. Looking back over the past few days, he realizes that living independently has gone much better than he expected. Although he had worried about managing everything on his own, his business has been surprisingly successful. Even so, he understands that repairing discarded equipment and selling leftover cursed items will not provide a stable income forever. He decides that he should soon begin accepting proper guild quests to gather fresh materials before eventually moving on to another town. As he walks downstairs, he suddenly notices his former party standing at the guild counter. Quickly hiding from view, Gale quietly listens to the conversation. The Wolf Pack is requesting financial assistance from the guild, arguing that they are an S-rank party and deserve an advance of 10 to 20 gold coins. The guild receptionist refuses. She explains that approving such funding is impossible because the party has failed to complete a single quest successfully since reaching S-rank. Kush argues that they still have plenty of time to complete future requests. The receptionist reminds him that they never even met with one of their clients, who has already submitted a formal complaint after being ignored by an S-rank party. The Wolfpack attempts to defend themselves by explaining that they encountered dangerous monsters during the journey. The receptionist points out that the monster in question was merely an ogre, an A-rank threat that should have posed little difficulty for an S-rank party. The members insist that it was some kind of mutant. The receptionist immediately rejects that excuse, explaining that the guild confirmed it was an entirely ordinary ogre. She also knows that the party irresponsibly lured the monster all the way back toward town, endangering countless civilians. She adds that this is only one of several serious mistakes they have made. Kush grows irritated by the criticism, but the receptionist continues. She brings up Moria's resignation only a few days after joining the Wolfpack. The Silver Wolf has already submitted both a complaint and a bill for the damages caused during the fight. Since the guild covered those expenses, the Wolfpack now owes money to the guild itself. Watching from hiding, Gale quietly realizes just how much trouble his former teammates have fallen into. Their appearance confirms it as well. The receptionist finally slams her fist onto the counter and warns them not to ask for investments again until they first repay every debt they currently owe. Furious, Kush blames everything on Gale. According to him, ever since Gale supposedly cursed them, the party's abilities have drastically declined, and even powerful buffs no longer seem effective. Listening from his hiding place, Gale is completely confused. From his perspective, he only removed his own curses from their equipment. Luke agrees with Kush and claims that Moria was equally useless. Nora supports that opinion as well. The receptionist has heard enough. She informs them that Moria ranks among the 5 greatest support mages in the entire capital. Because of difficulties with her previous party, the guild personally recommended her to the Wolf Pack, believing they were talented enough to appreciate her abilities. The party is stunned. None of them realized that Moria possessed such an extraordinary reputation. Gale is equally surprised. The The receptionist then turns the conversation toward Gale himself. She cannot understand why they continue blaming him. According to her, curse crafters with Gale's level of talent are extraordinarily rare. His dispel talismans alone are worth tremendous amounts of money. Hearing his work praised so openly causes Gale to blush. He quietly remembers occasionally crafting dispel talismans for the guild as extra work. The receptionist concludes by ordering the wolf pack to repay every debt before even thinking about requesting financial support again. Realizing they have no choice, Kush promises they will settle everything as quickly as possible. The party leaves the guild. Melissa briefly brings up searching for Gale, but Norris reminds everyone that earning money through manageable quests must come first. Luke suggests avoiding all S-rank missions until they somehow remove the mysterious curse they believe still affects them. Growing increasingly irritated, Kush orders everyone to stop talking before storming away. Nearby adventurers quietly whisper that the famous S-rank party looks nothing like they expected. After they leave, Gale continues wondering why they are still convinced they remain cursed. Since he removed all of his curses long ago, he cannot understand what they are talking about. Deciding it is safer not to cross paths with them, he quickly exits the guild. Outside, numerous guards rush through the streets. Gale overhears them discussing another major argument between Princess Kara and Vivian. Apparently, their disagreements escalate so dramatically that entire squads of soldiers are regularly required to intervene. Gale finds it astonishing that the capital's military responds to personal disputes inside the royal castle. Since he is already nearby, he decides to visit the merchant who previously helped him establish his market stall. Meanwhile, inside the royal castle, soldiers desperately attempt to calm Vivian. She refuses to listen. Princess Kara remains hidden beneath her blankets, while Vivian angrily insists that the princess's ring is cursed. Everyone present gasps. Vivian recalls warning Kara before she tried it on, but the princess insisted on wearing it anyway. Once the ring slipped onto her finger, neither of them could remove it despite repeated attempts. An elderly church official immediately orders that the ring be removed. Princess Kara quietly admits that removing it is no longer possible. Believing there is no other solution before the diplomatic meeting begins, Vivian prepares to cut off the princess's finger. The guards panic and rush forward to protect the princess before the drastic measure can be carried out. The following day, Princess Kara formally welcomes the visiting foreign envoys. The diplomats respectfully compliment her appearance. When they notice the ring on her finger, she casually explains that she injured herself. Earlier attempts to remove the ring had failed completely before the envoys arrived. After politely welcoming the visitors, Kara offers to prepare tea. Instead, the envoys present what they claim are luxurious gifts from the Empire. A massive crate is brought into the audience chamber. Curious, Princess Kara eagerly looks forward to seeing the imperial delicacies. Instead, armed assassins suddenly emerge from inside the crate. Disguised as envoys, they reveal poisoned daggers capable of killing instantly. Chaos erupts throughout the chamber. Vivian immediately orders the guards to attack while the assassins rush directly toward the princess. Believing victory assured, they strike. Their weapons never reach her. Every spear and dagger rebounds harmlessly as though striking an invisible wall. Both the attackers and Princess Kara stare in complete disbelief. The assassins attack repeatedly. Every strike is repelled by the unseen barrier. Unable to understand what is protecting her, they become increasingly confused. At that moment, Princess Kara suddenly remembers Gale. She recalls being the very first customer to genuinely compliment his designs. Vivian orders the guards to capture every assassin. After confirming that the princess is completely unharmed, she begins wondering why anyone would disguise themselves as imperial envoys. For the moment, however, she decides that moving the princess somewhere secure is far more important. Later, inside the Star Chamber, several experts gather to examine the mysterious ring. They ask the bishop and the appraiser, Arizel, for their professional opinions. The bishop explains that the ring itself is not particularly difficult to dispel. What astonishes him is the craftsmanship. The curse has been engineered with extraordinary sophistication by someone possessing profound knowledge of curse magic. Normally, a curse powerful enough to produce such overwhelming benefits would also impose equally overwhelming penalties. Instead, the creator layered multiple reciprocal curses together so that each negative effect canceled another one. The result is an item with incredible power and almost no meaningful drawback. The explanation becomes so technical that Princess Kara quickly loses track of it. The bishop continues explaining until Arizel begins evaluating the item's actual abilities. According to him, the ring triples its wearer's defensive power while granting complete resistance against instant death attacks. Vivian is shocked. Arizel explains that the ring possesses abilities equal to those found in legendary cursed holy relics. Overcome with excitement, he remarks that he never expected to witness such an extraordinary cursed item so early in his career. Before he can continue admiring it, Vivian strikes him on the head for continuing to hold the princess's hand while examining the ring. Trying to remain objective, Vivian recalls that the church's angel shield possesses similar protection against instantly lethal attacks. The bishop agrees. Very few artifacts in existence provide comparable abilities. He then mentions one legendary exception. The Heart of the Devil, the Empire's greatest treasure, grants countless high-level effects, including resistance against instant death, increased statistics, faster spellcasting, and many other extraordinary powers. However, it exacts an equally terrible price by continuously draining the life force of its wearer until death unless the curse is removed in time. Vivian explains that such devastating penalties are normally the unavoidable cost of obtaining effects that powerful. That is simply how cursed artifacts function. Yet Princess Kara's ring possesses almost none of those drawbacks. Because of that, it cannot merely be compared to a holy relic. Its overall value may actually exceed one. After hearing the explanation, Princess Kara asks Vivian whether she remembers the merchant who sold her the ring. Vivian confirms that she remembers his appearance perfectly. Assuming the princess wishes to punish him, she asks whether he should be hunted down and executed. Princess Kara immediately rejects the idea. Instead, she wishes to find him so she can personally thank him. Regardless of whether the ring is cursed, it unquestionably saved her life. More than anything else, she hopes to meet him again. At the beginning of Chapter 6, Gale prepared to leave the capital. He wore a cloak with side pockets for storing gear, along with wire-lined wrist sleeves that offered additional storage. His boots also contained built-in protectors. Carrying only his handmade dagger and essential equipment, he decided to obtain whatever else he needed during his journey. Standing atop the city walls, he looked over the capital one last time. The cool morning air drifted through the streets as the townspeople gradually began their daily routines, replacing the early morning silence with the sounds of life. Now that he was finally leaving the capital behind, he found himself unexpectedly emotional. As he passed a dark alley, something caught his attention. Curious, he glanced inside and was surprised to discover his former guild party huddled there in an awkward argument. After watching them briefly, he simply shook his head and continued walking. The marketplace was already bustling with activity. Merchants shouted to one another while laborers discussed where additional workers were needed. Nearby, others mentioned that the palace guards were already securing the city gates. Before long, the sound of galloping horses echoed through the streets. Gale turned to see both the Royal Knight Corps and the capital army riding through the city. Wondering what could possibly be happening, he continued watching until he noticed wanted posters plastered across nearby walls. The posters depicted a scruffy young man with black hair who supposedly sold tacky decorations on the streets. Anyone who found him was instructed to report to the castle or the nearest knight. Several knights discussed the search among themselves. They had already checked the plaza, every inn, and every adventurer's guild, yet they still had not found their target. Gale listened while pretending to know nothing. He silently amused himself. The previous time they had searched for him, they had described him perfectly. This time, however, the description clearly referred to someone else. Besides, his products were not tacky. One knight complained that they had far too little information to work with. As his gaze landed on Gale, he briefly suspected him because of his age. After looking him over more carefully, however, the knight concluded that Gale appeared far too neat to match the wanted poster. The man they sought was supposed to look dirtier and sell bizarre merchandise. Satisfied, the knight allowed Gale to continue on his way. Stopping beside a nearby wall, Gale sighed to himself. He realized he had been acting sentimental over a city he was already planning to leave. At the city gate, numerous stagecoaches waited for departing travelers. Gale considered his options carefully. He could head toward Emirates, a major trade city, visit Gracias Fort, the military stronghold, or travel to Grandstadt, the old city. Just then, a coachman loudly announced a last-minute discount for the remaining 2 seats aboard a carriage bound for Farmage, an agricultural center. The moment Gale heard the word discount, his interest was immediately piqued. After hearing that the destination was Farmage, thoughts of fresh food made him practically drool. Without hesitation, he claimed one of the remaining seats. Just as he did, another traveler claimed the final seat. Looking over, Gale immediately recognized the woman. She was Moria Glaris, the support mage who had previously traveled alongside Kush. The moment she removed her cloak, Gale remembered exactly who she was. Unfortunately, his first thought focused on her appearance, particularly her figure. Moria immediately noticed where his thoughts had wandered. Before Gale could properly recover, she struck him hard enough to leave his cheek aching. The two eventually boarded the carriage together. Despite the rough beginning, Gale suggested that they simply get along for the duration of the journey. Moria sarcastically replied, through her expression, that she would be delighted. The carriage soon departed from the capital. Because of the cramped seating arrangement, Gale accidentally leaned slightly toward Moria while trying to get comfortable. She immediately shoved him away. Apologizing, Gale pointed out that there simply was not much room inside the wagon. Looking around, he observed crates of imported metal goods, armed mercenaries guarding the cargo, several ordinary travelers, and Moria sitting beside him. He realized that she had already left the Wolfpack party surprisingly quickly. Unable to relax in such an awkward atmosphere, Gale admitted that they had not exactly gotten off to a good start and hoped they could simply avoid making things worse. Moria insisted that she was not angry. Thinking back on everything, Gale realized that Moria herself had never been responsible for the way his former party treated him. Kush had likely become infatuated with her, and the others had probably intended to remove Gale from the party eventually regardless. Curious, Gale asked why she had left the Wolfpack. Moria responded by asking a much more surprising question. She wondered why Gale himself had stayed with such an incompetent party for so long. She explained what had happened after Gale left. Apparently, Kush had completely failed to handle even a single ogre encounter. The remaining members lacked both experience and competence, making the party practically dysfunctional. Moria questioned what had ever possessed Gale to join such a hopeless group in the first place. After confirming that Kush truly was responsible, Gale learned that the guild itself had begun investigating him. Kush had even fled the capital until the situation settled down. According to Moria, the former party blamed Gale for every misfortune that had happened to them. From her perspective, however, Gale had been the only reliable member among them. Hearing that made Gale smile faintly. Realizing she might have spoken too bluntly about people Gale once knew, Moria apologized. Gale assured her that he did not mind and instead apologized for the trouble his former companions had caused her. Moria insisted none of it had been his fault. After asking her to simply call him Gale instead of using formalities, the conversation briefly fell silent. Gale noticed that Moria carried very little luggage. It appeared she had boarded the carriage almost immediately after leaving the party. Feeling a little sorry for her, he pulled out a bread roll, quickly sliced several ingredients, and assembled a simple sandwich before offering it to her. He jokingly welcomed her to what he called the Wolfpack Victims Club. Moria accepted the sandwich while remarking that she was not entirely convinced Gale deserved to call himself a victim. Still, the food immediately caught her attention. Gale also offered sandwiches to the other passengers aboard the carriage. After taking a bite, Moria praised the meal, amazed that he had prepared it so quickly. Laughing, Gale credited the quality of the ingredients rather than his own cooking. He then produced a bottle of expensive wine. Moria initially teased him for trying to get her drunk before realizing the bottle contained rare Romange wine, an incredibly valuable vintage. Surprised, she questioned whether he was really willing to share something so expensive. Gale casually explained that his street stall had sold quite well. As she opened the bottle, Moria mentioned hearing rumors that someone had unknowingly sold artifact-class items from an ordinary market stall. Even the princess herself had reportedly begun searching for the mysterious seller. Completely unaware that the rumors referred to him, Gale simply remarked that anyone foolish enough to sell an artifact like that must have been incredibly careless. Thinking back briefly to his previous encounter with the princess, he dismissed the possibility that it could somehow involve him. Moria jokingly questioned whether he might secretly possess artifacts himself. Gale asked whether he honestly looked like someone capable of producing legendary items. Moria admitted that he certainly did not. Pretending to be offended, Gale wished she had at least lied to spare his feelings. The two joked about legendary craftsmen supposedly living as mysterious mountain hermits. Gale suddenly exaggerated his expression into that of a wrinkled old sage. The ridiculous face made Moria burst into uncontrollable laughter, her cheerful voice filling the entire carriage. The two shared a high five. By then, Moria admitted she was beginning to like Gale. Gale likewise confessed that he no longer disliked her either. He quietly thought that, had they both been frontline fighters, they might have made an excellent team someday. Before the thought could continue, the entire carriage was struck violently. Everything lurched. Outside, frantic shouting erupted. The caravan had come under attack by orcs. The sudden impact threw Gale against Moria, leaving him pressed awkwardly against her. She immediately shoved him away, reminding him that this was hardly the time. Outside, the situation rapidly deteriorated. The caravan's mercenary guards had already been overwhelmed. Terrified passengers crowded together while the approaching orcs turned their attention toward the carriage. Moria quickly realized that no one inside possessed enough combatability to defend everyone. Looking around at the frightened travelers, she asked Gale whether he carried any weapons. He admitted that he only possessed a short sword and several one-use debuff talismans. It was hardly an impressive arsenal. Moria acknowledged that their chances were poor, but she refused to simply remain inside waiting to die. Although she specialized as a support mage and rarely fought directly, she insisted that standing and fighting was preferable to doing nothing. Gale finally agreed, declaring that he would handle the front line while she supported him from behind. He prepared himself for battle. Moria apologized for placing him in such a dangerous position. Gale assured her that he would never allow a woman to fight alone while he stood by. Together, the two former S-rank party members prepared themselves to face the approaching orcs. As the monsters closed in, Gale realized they likely underestimated the pair completely. He intended to use that overconfidence to eliminate at least one enemy immediately. Meanwhile, Moria scattered several small stones across the ground. Swinging her staff, she erected a magical barrier around the carriage. She explained that the defensive wall would buy them some time, while she prepared enhancement magic. Gale admired how quickly she thought through the situation. Gripping his handmade dagger tightly, he readied himself. As Moria began casting another spell, she suddenly noticed the strange black aura swirling around Gale's dagger. The sight immediately caught her attention. At the start of Chapter 7, Moria explained that their strategy was simple. Buff magic had little immediate effect, so she would have to time it carefully. Once her enhancement fully activated, she was confident Gale would be able to take down at least one orc. After that, he would use his curses to bind the monsters while eliminating as many as possible. Gale nodded. If they could hold out long enough, a patrol should notice something was wrong. Beyond that, they would just have to rely on luck. Moria sighed. She knew she had said that, but she couldn't help asking what the creepy weapon he was carrying was. It's just a normal debuffing dagger, Gale replied casually. Normal? Moria exclaimed in disbelief. Ignoring her reaction, Gale simply walked away. Just back me up, all right? She tried to stop him before quickly kneeling and drawing a magic circle on the ground. This won't last long, but the effect reaches farther than you can see. She began chanting, "Elevate all." A faint glow surrounded Gale. Whoa! He grinned before throwing a cross-shaped cursed item toward the group of orcs. Nice range. That was a perfect throw. The scroll attached to the item unfolded as it landed. Without hesitation, Gale rushed straight toward the monsters. The orcs immediately turned their attention to him, but dark curses had already spread around them. Moria stared in disbelief. The orcs grunted and staggered in confusion. Even her knees trembled as she sensed the curse. What kind of curse is that? It was one of Gale's disposable debuff items. It appeared to affect only hostile monsters, yet merely standing near it made her feel as though it could drag her in if she let her guard down. The aura alone was unsettling. They're all going down together, Gale shouted. Moria called after him. Wait, you're too fast. My buff hasn't fully activated yet. An orc roared and charged. To her complete shock, Gale stepped forward and cleanly beheaded it with a single slash. Without stopping, he dashed toward the remaining orcs and cut them down one after another. Wow, Moria, he laughed. Your buffs are amazing. She blinked. What? No, I had nothing to do with that. The curses blanketing the battlefield were far beyond ordinary debuffs. At the very least, they carried the effects of terror, anti-armor, and most likely paralysis as well. She had never heard of a disposable cursed item capable of stacking that many effects. And that dagger, even from where she stood, she could tell it constantly maintained 0 armor and sheep's clothing. He calls a legendary class blade like that normal? Moria buried her face in her hands. This is insane. Meanwhile, Gale noticed the light surrounding him. Moria's support magic had finally begun enhancing all of his physical abilities. Wow, Moria, I really have to thank you for this. She awkwardly replied, well, yes, kind of, but also no. Now even I can fight monsters like these. Moria sighed. I don't think you even need my buffs. Then she noticed something alarming. The glow surrounding Gale was fading. I forgot to keep supplying it with magic. She quickly apologized. Sorry, I'll fix it. Don't worry. Gale simply smiled. With you supporting me, we're practically invincible. Why is he so excited? Moria wondered. Gale suddenly leaped high into the air and cut down another orc. One more. The final orc stood before him, but then it roared. More orcs emerged from the forest. Fine then, Gale threw several cursed items into the approaching horde. Moments later, a deafening blast echoed across the battlefield. When the smoke cleared, every orc had collapsed. Awesome, Gale cheered. Thanks to your buffs. Moria frowned. The monsters had practically frozen after being affected by his slow curse. Slow doesn't normally reduce movement speed by 90%. Can he please stop giving me credit? He had completely misunderstood what was happening. Then Moria watched Gale slip behind one remaining orc and stab the back of its neck with his dagger. Another explosive impact echoed through the area. The orc collapsed instantly. An instant kill effect. She stared in disbelief. Items capable of that were unbelievably rare. There was no way someone could casually craft something like that by hand. None of this made any sense anymore. Gale turned toward her with a huge smile. We won. Moria sighed. Yeah, I mean, if you can do all that, then. Before she could finish, Gale grabbed both of her hands and happily spun her around. I can't believe it. Your support magic is incredible. Yeah, sure. Nearby, the passengers peeked out from their wagons. Gale waved cheerfully, and they all rushed over to thank them. Later that night, the group rested around the campfire. Gale admitted, I've never really fought monsters before. Honestly, I was terrified. Moria looked at him in surprise. You were? Weren't you part of Kush's party? I was, Gale replied with an awkward smile. I was one of the founding members, but I'm just a curse item craftsman. Moria was speechless. After a moment, she shook her head. Kush is an idiot for letting someone like you go. Gale laughed nervously. You really think so? Honestly, I can't blame him. Moria stared at him. Do you have any self-esteem at all? She took another sip of the dandelion coffee he had brewed. This is really good, too. You've got all kinds of tricks, she muttered. Gale scratched his cheek. I wouldn't go that far. I'd call it omnipotence. He laughed awkwardly. Come on, Moria. I'm not that useful in battle. Moria simply sighed. This conversation is going nowhere. You're really something. She stood up. I'm going to bed. Thanks for the coffee. Sure. Good night. As Moria returned to her tent, the others remained around the campfire. Gale smiled to himself. Omnipotence, huh? He had never thought of himself that way. Even today, he believed they had only won because of Moria's support. Still, thinking back to the days when he traveled with his old guild, he realized something. Fighting monsters had actually been fun. He chuckled quietly. Moria really is nice to me. The following morning, the caravan resumed its journey. We should be able to see it soon, the driver announced. Moria nudged the still sleeping Gale. We're almost there. He rubbed his eyes. We've arrived? Yeah. Gale looked ahead as the city finally came into view. So this is Farmage. The caravan slowly approached the town gates. Gale and Moria arrived in Farmage, a peaceful agricultural town located about an hour from the border. The area was filled with farmland, grazing animals, and countless fields stretching into the distance. Looking around, Gale commented on how rural the town was. Moria agreed, noting that there seemed to be nothing but farms and pastures everywhere. She then asked Gale what he planned to do next. Gale explained that he intended to visit the Adventurers Guild, exchange the orc materials they had collected for money, and begin accepting quests. Moria decided to accompany him to the guild since she also wanted to search for a new party. She asked whether Gale planned to join another group as well. Gale declined. For the time being, he wanted to try working alone. At the Farmage Adventurers Guild, Gale browsed the available requests. Moria was surprised by the quest he selected. It was an A-rank mission to eliminate undead. She immediately objected, reminding him that both of them specialized in rear-line support roles. Their battle against the orcs had only succeeded because of unusual circumstances. Gale simply smiled and asked her to help him again. Hunting undead happened to be one of his specialties. Before Moria could respond, a dark elf greeted them. She welcomed the newcomers and asked if they were looking to accept a quest. Gale introduced himself, explaining that he had recently arrived from the capital to seek work. The dark elf happily informed them that Farmage desperately needed adventurers. As a farming and trading town, it had very few fighters available. She enthusiastically held Gale's hands while thanking him for coming. Gale immediately found himself blushing. Watching from behind, Moria quietly coughed. The elf noticed her and asked whether she was Gale's companion. Moria explained that she had also come from the capital. As a support mage, she hoped to assist however she could. The elf's eyes sparkled with excitement. Support mages were also in high demand. Turning back to Gale, she guessed that he might be a thief because of his relatively light equipment. Gale corrected her, explaining that he was actually another support specialist, a curse crafter. The elf seemed surprised. Gale quickly added that although support was his primary role, he was capable of fighting as well. Embarrassed, the elf apologized. She clarified that curse crafters were simply extremely rare in Farmage, and she wasn't certain whether the town even had suitable work for someone with his profession. Gale blushed once again. Moria looked increasingly irritated. Gale explained that he simply wanted to complete a few quests first in order to familiarize himself with the area. The elf looked over his request form and realized he had chosen the Lich Extermination quest. She informed him that the mission had remained unfinished for a long time. When Gale asked why, she explained that the town lacked powerful clerics capable of entering the crypt. As a result, no one had accepted the quest. Families could no longer visit the graves of their loved ones, while the undead continued to roam freely, creating an endless cycle of suffering. She warned Gale that attempting the mission as a curse crafter might become nothing more than a one-way trip. Moria interrupted. commenting that the warning could have been phrased more gently. Gale calmly replied that he had grown accustomed to hearing such things. Even when Moria wanted to defend him further, Gale reassured her that everything would be fine. The elf reminded him not to say she hadn't warned him. Since no one had completed the mission, there would be no rescue party if he got into trouble. Gale accepted the warning and asked for a map of the crypt. The elf offered to sell him holy water and magical supplies. Instead, Gale purchased only the map. As she explained the proof required for completing the quest, Gale casually mentioned that the guild would need the lich's jawbones as evidence. The elf found it odd that he seemed so familiar with such materials. Smiling warmly, she leaned toward him and wished him luck, mentioning again how desperately the town needed capable adventurers. Gale's face grew even redder. At that exact moment, Moria deliberately stepped on his toes. The elf laughed, commenting that the two of them seemed to get along remarkably well. She then introduced herself properly. Her name was Gimli, and she served as the guild master of Farmage's Adventurers Guild. After welcoming them to town, she bowed politely and expressed her hopes of working with them. Gale returned the greeting. Remembering something, he also handed over the sack of orc materials he had collected. Seeing the contents, Gimli stared in amazement. Gale cheerfully announced that they would tackle the Lich quest the following day. Watching him leave, Gimli quietly remarked that he seemed far too casual about moving to an entirely new town. She admitted that her comment had not been intended as praise. Outside the guild, Moria questioned why Gale had been staring so much at Gimli simply because the guild master had shown him a little kindness. Gale pretended not to understand. Moria dismissed the subject, though she eventually admitted that she had decided to accompany him after all. Gale pointed out that she had intended to do so from the very beginning. Unable to deny it, Moria became flustered. She insisted that she was not worried about him. She simply could not stand watching him recklessly throw himself into danger, so she considered herself nothing more than his emergency backup. Looking at her with genuine appreciation, Gale admitted that having her around made him feel much more reassured. Moria blushed even more intensely. She complained that he had an incredible ability to say embarrassing things with a perfectly straight face. Gale confessed that this would be his very first solo quest, and he was honestly nervous. Moria replied that anyone accepting an undead extermination mission ought to be nervous. Instead, Gale looked genuinely excited. To him, undead monsters represented valuable materials for crafting cursed items. He could hardly wait to begin collecting them. That evening, Gimli reflected on the mysterious newcomer. She found it impossible to believe that Gale was an ordinary curse crafter. The following morning, Gale cheerfully announced that he had slept wonderfully. Moria corrected him. He had actually overslept until nearly noon. As they walked through Farmage, Gale noticed curious villagers watching them. Moria explained that armed adventurers were extremely rare in a town focused almost entirely on farming and trade, making them an unusual sight. Eventually, they arrived at the entrance to the ancient crypt. Gale enthusiastically suggested finishing the quest quickly. Moria carefully checked all of her supplies, including her silver knife, anti-undead incense, and holy water. Gale teased her for worrying so much. She replied that she was simply being prepared. Gale confidently claimed that everything would be fine because dealing with undead happened to be one of his specialties. His relaxed attitude only made Moria even more anxious. She insisted that if anything went wrong, they would immediately retreat together. Gale agreed without hesitation. He understood how difficult protecting the rear line could be for her. Soon they reached the entrance. Beyond it lay a massive underground cemetery. Instead of being intimidated, Gale admired the impressive view. Moria quickly reminded him that they were not tourists. Looking around, she commented on how terrible the place looked. Gale guessed that the undead had probably caused most of the destruction. He casually began tossing aside scattered skeleton bones. Moria demanded to know what he was doing. Gale pointed out that disturbed bones could reveal recent footprints. Moria explained that the cemetery had originally been constructed over an ancient dungeon many years ago. Judging by its size, the site was extremely old. She worried they might be disrespecting the dead. Gale asked how else they were supposed to explore deeper into the crypt. Moria clasped her hands in prayer out of respect. Gale remarked that she seemed remarkably devoted. Moria answered that compared to him, almost anyone would appear devout. Gale then pointed out that the skull she had just prayed over actually belonged to an undead creature. Since it was daytime, it was merely dormant, but it would likely awaken after sunset. To demonstrate, he held the skull directly in front of her face. Startled, Moria immediately smashed it. Turning away, she insisted that undead were no longer people. They were simply monsters. Gale quietly thought that she could have waited outside if she disliked the place so much. He explained that the cemetery had not become overrun very long ago, meaning the upper levels would only contain relatively weak undead. Moria found that statement anything but reassuring. Gale suggested venturing deeper to collect higher-quality crafting materials. He even offered to let Moria return outside, so she would not waste her holy water. Handing her a lantern, he cheerfully waved goodbye before heading deeper into the crypt. Left alone in the darkness, Moria complained that Wolfpack members always seemed incredibly self-centered. Glancing nervously around the gloomy corridors, she eventually forced herself to chase after him. Deep inside the cemetery, Moria desperately wanted to leave. Suddenly, something brushed past her. She screamed. Gale suggested she had probably imagined it. Tears forming in her eyes, Moria insisted that something had definitely touched her. She immediately clung tightly to Gale. Slightly embarrassed, Gale blushed. Another loud noise echoed through the crypt. Moria hugged him even tighter while continuing to scream. Trying to calm her, Gale searched for the source of the sound. He briefly became aware that she was pressing tightly against him before forcing himself to focus. Moments later, he discovered that the mysterious noise had been caused by nothing more than a bat. Realizing what had happened, Moria shoved him away. She claimed she had only wanted revenge for his earlier prank with the skull. After all, skeletons were merely piles of bones. The moment she turned around, however, she came face to face with an actual skeleton. Terrified, she leaped directly back into Gale's arms while screaming at the top of her lungs. Now, carrying Moria, Gale complained that she was shouting directly into his ear. Still panicking, she struggled helplessly. He repeatedly asked her to calm down. With tears streaming down her face, Moria admitted that she simply couldn't. Gale asked her to at least stop screaming into his ear. As she finally opened her eyes, another skeleton stared directly back at her. That proved to be too much. Moria completely lost control. Flailing wildly, she smashed another skeleton apart while shouting at it to stay away from her. Gale stared in astonishment. Grabbing the lantern, Moria hurled it directly into the approaching undead. The burning lantern ignited the skeletons. When Gale turned around, they were already engulfed in flames. Another skeleton advanced toward Moria. Panicking once again, she shoved Gale directly into the monster before retreating. Later, after things had quieted down, Gale asked whether she had finally calmed herself. Moria apologized. Gale gently asked why she had followed him if she was so frightened of undead. Looking away, Moria admitted that she simply believed hunting undead alone was far too dangerous. She had been worried about him. Gale reminded her once again that he specialized in fighting undead as a curse crafter. Nevertheless, he sincerely thanked her for caring about his safety. Offering her his hand, he helped her back to her feet. They had already descended too deeply into the crypt for her to safely return alone. He asked whether she could endure just a little longer. Moria quietly agreed. Gale suggested that if she became frightened again, she could simply close her eyes. Moria immediately objected, pointing out that she would become hopelessly lost. Smiling reassuringly, Gale suggested another solution. She could simply hold his hand, and they would walk slowly together. Both of them immediately blushed. As they found themselves walking hand in hand through the crypt, Gale silently realized that he had only meant it as a joke. Shortly before Gale and Moria left the capital, the Wolfpack party visited a blacksmith to sell some of their equipment, but the smith refused to deal with them, calling them ruffians. Later, the party gathered in an alley, hungry, cold, and desperate for money after spending another night on the streets. Luke brought back several guild quests: an A-rank ogre hunt worth 60 gold coins, a C-rank mission to eliminate skeleton knights at the old church grounds, an E-rank goblin soldier extermination, and a D-rank orc hunt. The others were offended that an S-rank party had been reduced to considering such low-rank jobs, but Norris reminded them they were in no condition to take on difficult missions and needed to rebuild their strength. Kush considered the lucrative ogre quest, but quickly dismissed it after recalling their previous encounter with an ogre, insisting it was not because they were afraid. Since there were no S-rank requests available, Melissa proposed taking the Skeleton Knight quest, believing skeletons would be easy opponents despite Norris suggesting the orc mission instead. Eventually, they accepted the C-rank quest and headed to the old church grounds, where Luke scouted about 20 skeleton knights hiding beyond the gate. Kush confidently devised a strategy with himself and Melissa leading the charge while Norris provided fire magic and Luke supported from afar. The moment they entered and the protective barrier disappeared, the skeleton knights rose and advanced. Kush and Melissa rushed forward confidently, but before Kush could finish boasting about the easy reward, both were struck in the face by flying bones and blasted backward. More skeletons surrounded them and continued beating them while they were still on the ground. Norris hastily cast Inferno, producing only a tiny ball of condensed fire that barely harmed the undead before they turned their attention toward him and Luke. The two immediately fled and slammed the gate behind them, resulting in the complete failure of the Rank C quest. The following day, they attempted the D-rank orc mission. Melissa leaped onto an orc and drove her sword into it, only for the blade to become stuck. As everyone urged her to finish it, the orc grabbed her arm and lifted her into the air while she desperately called for Kush's help. After staring at her briefly, the orc simply released her and walked away. Norris and Luke laughed, joking that she was not even the orc's type, much to Melissa's embarrassment. Seeing the orc's back exposed, Kush charged in and struck it, but his sword bounced harmlessly off its hide. The irritated orc turned around, and after Kush instinctively apologized, it swatted the party away with one powerful blow, causing another failed quest. Several days later, the exhausted party returned to the Adventurers Guild in the capital, once again blaming all of their failures on Gale. Kush complained that he had even sold his favorite equipment, while bystanders whispered about how far the once-proud S-rank party had fallen. Norris suggested tracking Gale down once they had enough money, while Luke wondered if Gale was truly still operating a market stall. They then accepted an E-rank goblin mission, believing it would at least be manageable. When they first arrived, the grateful villagers praised the S-rank wolf pack, and Kush confidently promised they would solve everything without the villagers lifting a finger. However, when a mounted goblins attacked, the entire party was once again completely defeated. Returning to the guild battered and humiliated, Kush complained that the villagers had refused to pay because they considered the party useless. The receptionist bluntly suggested they should give up their S-rank status altogether. Furious, Kush grabbed her by the collar and demanded an easier quest, but she calmly seized his arm and punched him across the face, knocking him to the floor while the other three stood frozen. Meanwhile, deep within the cemetery, Gale admired the abundance of undead materials available as he and Moria descended farther into the crypt, where wandering souls became increasingly numerous. Moria nervously tugged on his sleeve and asked if something was nearby. Gale calmly insisted there was nothing, even though she could clearly hear the clicking of undead bones, and clung tightly to him with her eyes shut. Just then a skeletal arm rose from a grave, followed by an ordinary skeleton, and then an enormous skeleton emerging from another grave. Terrified, Moria insisted she had known something was there and hesitantly asked if she could open her eyes. Gale reassured her that nothing would be there for another 3 seconds before casually gesturing toward the undead and casting Dispel, instantly causing the skeleton to dissolve into dust. By the time Moria opened her eyes, the monster had already crumbled away. Stunned, she realized he had defeated an undead simply by using a Dispel spell, something she had never heard of before. Gale casually explained that it was easy and somewhat similar to what Priest did, though not exactly the same. When Moria assumed he meant holy banishment, Gale replied that he was not actually banishing the dead. After thinking about how to explain it, he clarified that what he did was not destroying their souls at all, but rather listening to their stories. At the start of Chapter 10, Gale held a skull while Moria looked uncertain about what he had just explained. She questioned what he meant by saying that he listened to the undead and wondered how that differed from what Priest did. Gale told her to slow down and promised to explain everything. He first asked her what caused the undead to move, and she guessed that it was because of magic or malice. He agreed, but at that moment, an undead creature suddenly rose behind her, making her scream. Gale quickly turned and defeated it before continuing his explanation. He told her that crypts were full of undead driven by lingering emotions and resentment. Priests usually purified or banished them immediately, but Gale believed that from the undead's perspective, they were simply being driven away without anyone ever listening to them. To help her understand, he compared it to a child being scolded by their parents without being allowed to explain their side of the story. His words reminded Moria of her childhood. She recalled how she once told her father that she wanted to become an adventurer, only for him to reject the idea outright because she was a girl. Before she could dwell on the memory any longer, Gale brought her back to the present. She brushed it aside and told him it was nothing. Gale continued by explaining that undead usually carried regrets such as dying hungry, dying alone, or suffering terrible injustices before death. Sometimes their grudges were much stronger, especially if they had been tortured or falsely accused during life. According to him, simply listening to those lingering emotions and acknowledging them was often enough to let them finally move on. To demonstrate, Gale approached a coffin and opened it. An undead emerged, causing Moria to panic once again. She immediately leaped onto Gale in fear, clinging tightly to him while screaming. It was a dark skeleton knight, a dangerous B-rank undead that rear-line fighters were never meant to face directly. Gale found himself unable to breathe because she was pressing him so tightly against her chest. Since she refused to let go, he simply lifted her higher and continued walking toward the undead. The skeleton knight drew its sword while Moria cried in terror, convinced they were about to die. Gale calmly pointed at the monster and cast a spell. The magic shone brightly, and the undead instantly crumbled into dust. After setting Moria back on the ground, Gale told her it was over. Looking at the remains, Moria saw the spirit of a young knight appear above the fallen skeleton. The young man bowed gratefully toward Gale before peacefully disappearing. Gale smiled and explained that the knight had died before saying goodbye to his fiancée, and that lingering regret had kept him trapped. Moria was stunned. Gale simply explained that years of crafting cursed equipment had taught him how to read the subtle emotions left behind by the undead. By listening to those feelings and sympathizing with them, they could finally pass on peacefully. As an added benefit, curse crafters could harvest far better materials this way than priests could, since holy purification erased all cursed remnants. Moria struggled to accept everything she had just witnessed. She realized that Gale truly viewed undead as easy sources of crafting materials. She scolded him for treating terrifying monsters so casually and grabbed him by the collar, shaking him while insisting that he should apologize to every priest in the world for overturning everything they believed about the undead. Gale, confused by her reaction, simply asked why anyone would complain if the undead were being peacefully dispelled. To him, everyone benefited from the outcome. Moria could only clutch her aching head, convinced that something was seriously wrong with the way Gale's mind worked. Gale merely asked her to stop shouting into his ears before casually offering to let her hold his hand if she was frightened. She accepted without hesitation. The two continued descending deeper into the crypt while holding hands. Eventually, they reached the lowest level. Unlike the upper floors, this chamber was brightly illuminated by the pale glow of countless undead souls. Skeleton knights, ghoul archers, wights, dark phantoms, and many other undead filled the room. Moria estimated that there were around 50 of them gathered together. Gale asked whether she was really all right keeping her eyes open. She insisted that she was fine, although her trembling body betrayed her fear. Gale quietly observed the chamber and wondered why there were no liches present. Moria suggested they might have to come back another day if none appeared. Before she realized it, her staff slipped from her hands and crashed loudly onto the floor. Every undead in the chamber immediately turned toward the sound. Moria froze, believing they were finished. Instead of attacking, however, all the undead suddenly shivered. A new figure emerged from a doorway, carrying a horn. Unlike the others, this was clearly the ruler of the crypt. A sorcerer, a disaster-class undead capable of creating armies of undead and spreading terror across entire regions, if it ever reached the surface. Moria immediately recognized the danger and realized that only a high priest supported by an entire force of temple knights could hope to defeat such a monster. Gale, however, looked genuinely pleased because he had been hoping to find one. Moria couldn't believe what she was hearing. While they whispered to each other, explosions began tearing apart the pillars around them as the sorcerer's attacks shattered the chamber. Gale casually admitted that he didn't even attend church on his days off because he spent his time crafting cursed equipment and dispel talismans instead. Moria dragged him to safety as more blasts exploded around them. Meanwhile, the sorcerer's miasma spread through the room, empowering the surrounding undead. As the undead army closed in, Moria begged Gale to stop running in circles and simply retreat. Even a single direct hit from the sorcerer would kill them. Gale asked for just one more chance. Before Moria could object, he stabbed a special item into the ground. Brilliant light erupted across the chamber as Gale cast Dispel Blessing, a high priest-class spell specifically designed to free people from powerful curses. Moria stared in complete disbelief. Gale had casually created and carried an item capable of reproducing magic of that level. The overwhelming miasma filling the chamber instantly dispersed. One after another, every undead briefly returned to their human forms before peacefully fading away, leaving behind only an atmosphere of quiet fulfillment. Afterward, Gale stretched his arms and remarked that the air felt much fresher now. Moria sat on the ground with her face buried in her hands, swearing that she would never enter another crypt for the rest of her life. Gale had just defeated an entire undead army and a disaster-class sorcerer, as though it were nothing more than a relaxing day trip. Gale dismissed her reaction, wondering if mages encountered sorcerers all the time. Moria firmly explained that the church normally assembled entire platoons of temple knights just to deal with a single sorcerer. If they truly appeared everywhere, the world would have already fallen. Gale casually replied that he encountered them fairly often in large ancient crypts. He guessed that the sorcerer they had just defeated had once been the noble who ruled over that place. Moria asked whether he frequently explored crypts. Gale happily hugged his bag of collected materials, saying there was nothing more exciting than discovering valuable ingredients for making cursed equipment. Moria looked at him and concluded that he genuinely loved cursed items. Gale proudly agreed, explaining that crafting them was simply fun. She noticed the sorcerer's sword, the staff, and his favorite necklace among the loot he had collected. Gale admired how cool everything looked. Moria admitted that she could never understand his artistic taste. Gale protested, insisting that she simply failed to appreciate true beauty and that one day everyone else would eventually catch up to his sense of style. When Moria asked how his previous market stall had gone, Gale brightly recalled the girl who had genuinely loved his designs. He proudly explained that many people had called his creations unique and interesting, and that cursed equipment made excellent decorative items that also offered protection. Moria remained unconvinced. Gale laughed and insisted that people would eventually recognize the value of his creations and his shop. Hearing that reminded Moria of the day she first joined the wolf pack. She remembered standing at the guild while another party member impatiently shouted at someone named Gale to hurry up, calling him a burden. Another voice suggested leaving him behind altogether. The guild receptionist had introduced Wolfpack as a highly skilled S-rank party, despite their poor attitudes. Moria had accepted the offer simply because the pay was good. Gale had been expelled from the party that very same day. Back then he had been timid, constantly apologizing, and looked completely beaten down by the way his supposed friends treated him. Now, however, the man standing beside her was completely different. His eyes shone brightly with excitement and hope for the future. Watching him now, Moria quietly realized that perhaps everything had turned out for the best. She admitted that spending time with him had actually been fun. Gale teased her by pointing out that she had nearly cried several times during their adventure through the crypt. She immediately denied it, insisting she had not come close to crying. Gale laughed before sincerely thanking her. After being thrown out of his old party, he had wandered into this farming town completely alone. Even if he found success there, it still would have been a lonely journey by himself. Having someone beside him to laugh with had made all the difference, and he genuinely appreciated everything she had done for him. Moria's face turned bright red as she accused him of saying embarrassingly straightforward things that completely caught her off guard. After running a few steps away in embarrassment, she quietly admitted that she felt the same way and softly thanked him in return. Gale asked what she had just said because he hadn't heard her clearly. Moria could only sigh to herself, unable to believe just how unbelievably dense he really was. At the start of Chapter 11, Moria asked Gale what he planned to do with the reward money they had earned. Gale casually answered that they would split it evenly between them. Moria immediately objected, insisting that she had barely contributed anything. She believed that she had only slowed him down throughout the journey. Gale disagreed, explaining that every party member had a different role to play. Moria argued that her only role had been carrying some of his belongings. Looking at the enormous amount of equipment Gale was carrying, she wondered how he could possibly haul so much. Even an experienced porter would struggle with that load. Gale raised his arm and pointed to a bracelet made from skull. Moria called it disgusting, but Gale proudly explained that it was a cursed bracelet that increased storage capacity, enhanced physical strength, and reduced fatigue. He had specifically created it to make carrying equipment easier. Moria was stunned. An item like that could completely revolutionize warfare. She covered her face with her hand before asking whether Gale had ever seen actual magic tools sold in stores. Gale jokingly replied that the question was mean and assured her that he had. He explained that curse crafters always kept up with the latest trends, although he personally thought most modern magic items looked dull. Moria clarified that she was talking about their functions, not their appearance. She explained that ordinary magic items usually provided only a single effect because people could not handle multiple magical properties at once. Even the best commercial items only granted around a 10% improvement in a single area. Equipment with multiple powerful effects belonged to the realm of legendary artifacts or national treasures. Gale laughed and compared them to famous treasures before remarking that those looked especially boring. Moria sighed in frustration because he continued judging everything purely by appearance. In her mind, Gale's creations were incredible, but his sense of aesthetics and common sense were completely broken. Gale wondered why everyone cared so much about magical effects. In his opinion, enough creativity allowed a craftsman to fit almost any ability into an item. Since his equipment was cursed, that was simply how it worked. Moria silently thought that if innovation alone were enough, nobody would spend fortunes buying magic items. She asked if he truly considered ordinary magic tools to be little more than toys. Gale casually replied that they basically were, and even offered to make one for her on the spot. Moria immediately refused. She knew firsthand how dangerous cursed equipment normally was. Once someone equipped a cursed item, it could not be removed without specialized skills. On top of that, every curse demanded a terrible price. Some granted overwhelming offensive power but weakened the wearer under sunlight, while others caused confusion so severe that allies and enemies became indistinguishable. As she thought about Gale's abilities, however, a frightening possibility occurred to her. If someone could deliberately leave the curses intact while redesigning the balance between their costs and benefits, then it would be possible to create cursed equipment with almost no drawbacks while keeping the tremendous advantages. The realization sent a chill down her spine. She quietly admitted that Gale might truly become the kind of master craftsman capable of changing the world. Gale misunderstood her praise entirely and proudly agreed, believing she was talking about how beautiful his designs looked. Moria smiled sarcastically before telling him to forget it because, with a sense of style, he would never receive the recognition he deserved. Gale laughed and accused her of building him up only to tear him back down. Moria silently admitted that as long as his terrible design sense remained unchanged, the world would probably never notice his true talent. Soon Gale spotted the town ahead and suggested they catch a ride on a nearby cart. While he went to negotiate with the driver, Moria watched him from a distance. She found herself thinking that Gale was genuinely a good person and realized that she would not mind joining his party again. Later they returned to the Farmage Adventurers Guild, where Gimli greeted them with her usual cheerful welcome. She looked surprised that they had returned so quickly and assumed they had abandoned the quest. Gale smiled and placed several bags on the counter before asking her to assess the materials as proof of completion. Gimli opened the bags and was astonished to find remains from black skeletons, dark skeleton knights, and even a sorcerer. Realizing what they had accomplished, she immediately offered to increase the quest payment by 10%, then quickly changed it to 30%. Moria reminded her that the quest had been advertised as a lich hunt, yet the dungeon had evolved enough to contain a disaster-class sorcerer that could easily have killed them. She pointed out that the guild had provided inaccurate information and questioned whether offering such a small bonus was appropriate compensation. Gimli apologized, explaining that Farmage was a small guild whose information network was limited, and nervously proposed a 20% increase instead. Moria reluctantly accepted the compromise. Gale wondered why Moria seemed so upset. Moria explained that proper preparation was essential before accepting any quest. If someone prepared equipment for fire monsters only to discover that every enemy was ice-based instead, the consequences could be disastrous. Gale smiled and simply remarked that Moria was always kind to him. She quickly denied it. Gimli apologized again, admitting that she was still inexperienced as a guild master. Gale reassured her that it was understandable, because very few adventurers ever explored crypts that deeply. Gimli sadly admitted that she had trusted the grave digger's report without verifying it herself. Seeing her looking so dejected, Gale thought she looked incredibly cute whenever she was feeling down. He resisted the urge to comfort her too much and simply assured her that crypts happened to be his specialty. When he mentioned that he would occasionally patrol the surrounding crypts, Gimli's eyes sparkled with excitement. She thanked him enthusiastically and suddenly hugged him. Gale realized once again that despite her youthful appearance, she truly was the guild master. Before the embrace could last any longer, Moria forcefully pulled them apart and ordered Gimli to let go of Gale. Gale calmly asked whether the assessment could begin now, and Gimli immediately agreed. Afterward, Moria suspiciously asked Gale whether he liked girls who looked as young as Gimli. Gale was completely confused by the question and denied it immediately. Moria pointed out that he had been unusually gentle toward Gimli and had even been staring at her. Gale blushed and awkwardly denied everything. Moria claimed it was none of her business and turned away. Gale noticed her pouting and asked why she looked upset. She insisted she was not pouting at all before explaining that Gimli was far older than she appeared. In fact, the dark elf was probably over 100 years old. At that exact moment, a sharp object struck the floor nearby. Gimli innocently apologized, claiming her hand had simply slipped while preparing their rewards. Gale and Moria immediately realized she had intentionally thrown the object at them after hearing her age mentioned. Gimli placed the completed reward on the counter. Gale insisted on splitting the payment evenly despite Moria's repeated objections, leaving her with no choice but to accept while quietly thanking him. Gimli informed them that they could return later to collect the remaining assessed materials before cheerfully waving them goodbye. After the guild closed for the night, Gimli remained behind examining the materials. She quietly grumbled to herself about Moria revealing a girl's age so casually. Soon someone arrived to report confidential information. Gimli remarked that it was unusual to receive a visit so late at night and invited the visitor to speak. The messenger reported that Princess Kara had survived an assassination attempt thanks to a mysterious piece of cursed equipment that prevented instant death. Gimli immediately ruled out the possibility that it had been the Angel Shield because no holy relics had been sent to the princess. Instead, she concluded that an unknown artifact must have protected her. Curious, she asked who had been responsible for the attack. The messenger admitted that their identity remained uncertain, although the methods suggested military involvement. Gimli considered the possibility that the Empire might already be making its move and remarked that the situation sounded increasingly complicated. After promising to provide further information later, the messenger disappeared. Left alone, Gimli reflected on everything she knew. If conflict between the Empire and the capital truly erupted, it might become the perfect opportunity to advance her own mission. She also remembered Gale. From the moment she first met him, she had noticed the frightening number of cursed items hidden beneath his cloak. Somehow, he wore all of them without suffering any noticeable side effects. He had also defeated a disaster-class sorcerer accompanied by only a single support mage. To Gale, curses were nothing more than toys, and even undead disasters were little more than routine work. Later, while relaxing in her bath, Gimli reflected on her own circumstances. As a dark elf, she belonged to a race burdened by a terrible curse. The only way to free her people and restore their lost power was to obtain the legendary Heart of the Devil, the Empire's greatest treasure. Her position as guildmaster was merely a cover for gathering intelligence, while searching for a way to overcome the Empire's strict security. If tensions between the Empire and the kingdom continued to rise, the resulting chaos might finally create the opportunity she had been waiting for. She also wondered whether the mysterious cursed artifact that had saved Princess Kara's life might actually have been crafted by Gale himself. The thought made her smile. Opening a hidden room filled with mysterious items, Gimli quietly remarked to herself that Gale truly was an incredibly fascinating man. Meanwhile, back in the capital, Gale's former party visited a church in hopes of removing the curses they believed Gale had placed on them. After carefully examining all 4 of them, the priest announced that none of them were currently cursed. They were completely clean. Kush angrily insisted that the priest repeat the examination because Gale had obviously cursed them out of revenge after being expelled from the party. The priest calmly explained that while traces of powerful curses had once existed, every one of them had completely disappeared on the very day Gale left the wolf pack. In fact, considering how severe those curses had originally been, it was miraculous that they had survived them at all. After leaving the church, the group reluctantly realized what that meant. If they were no longer cursed, then their current abilities represented their true strength. Kush immediately rejected the idea, insisting that the priest had simply been incompetent. Luke admitted that he hated the conclusion too, but perhaps he really was only an average mage all along. Refusing to accept reality, Kush declared that they needed to find Gale immediately. He assumed Gale was probably homeless and starving somewhere in the city's back alleys, making those places the best locations to search. Luke suddenly apologized and announced that he had finally had enough. With most of their equipment sold just to survive and pay the church's fees, they could no longer afford even a single night at an inn. Looking at themselves, they appeared more suited to the back alleys than Gale ever would. Kush grabbed Luke in anger, demanding that he stop talking nonsense. Before the argument could continue, Luke suddenly froze. Confused, Kush asked what had happened. Luke pointed toward a nearby bulletin board. Curious, Kush rushed over and snatched a notice from it. Melissa and Norris watched in confusion as he burst into laughter. Luke smiled and admitted that perhaps Kush had not been completely wrong after all. The royal notice declared that the man shown in the poster was wanted dead or alive by the royal government. Anyone who delivered him to the authorities would receive a reward, while even useful information would be generously compensated. The proclamation bore the official seal of Gurman de Gherkin IV, chief of the royal office. Realizing the wanted man was Gale, Kush laughed triumphantly. Simply reporting his whereabouts would earn them money, but capturing him themselves could bring far greater rewards such as noble titles, land, wealth, or anything else they desired. Filled with excitement once again, the 4 immediately decided to act before anyone else claimed the prize. The royal office had not even opened for business yet, but that hardly mattered. They possessed something far more valuable than ordinary information. They had once been Gale's own party members. At the start of Chapter 12, Princess Kara questioned whether the informants Vivian had brought were genuine or merely swindlers hoping to claim the reward. Vivian assured her that they appeared to possess valuable information. The group consisted of S-rank adventurers from the Capital Adventurers Guild, and their identities had already been verified. According to them, they had been traveling with the young man they were searching for until recently. Before Vivian could continue, loud laughter echoed from the waiting room where the party was gathered. One of them had even placed his boots on the table, while another casually enjoyed the expensive tea cakes and asked for more. Their leader complained about being kept waiting by royalty and joked that they should charge the palace a late fee. Watching from outside, Kara quietly remarked that they did not seem like pleasant people and wondered if they truly deserved their S-rank status. Vivian replied that, for better or worse, they did. One of the men noticed the 2 women watching and rudely called out to them. Mistaking Kara for an ordinary noblewoman, he arrogantly demanded that she address him properly and insisted that only royalty had the privilege of calling him by his first name. Vivian was about to intervene, but Kara gently stopped her. Remaining polite, Kara introduced herself as Princess Kara de Gherkin and apologized for making them wait while she observed them. Hearing her introduction, the entire party immediately dropped to the floor in panic, bowing deeply and apologizing for their disrespect. Kara brushed the matter aside and directed the conversation back to business. She asked if they truly knew the man featured on the wanted poster. Smirking confidently, they assured her that they certainly did. Vivian requested that they describe the young man. They explained that he had black hair, dark eyes, and an average build. Vivian pointed out that such a description could match thousands of people. They added that he wore a tacky, bluish-green jacket and carried equally tasteless accessories that he had crafted himself. Hearing this, Kara's eyes lit up with excitement. Another member criticized the accessories for lacking any sense of beauty, but Kara immediately disagreed in her heart, believing they were wonderful works of art. Confused by her reaction, the group continued and finally revealed the young man's name, Gale, a curse crafter and their former companion. To support their claim, one of them presented several cursed accessories that had once belonged to Gale, including a dark skeleton eye-tooth ring, a carnivorous palette knife, and a witch powder necklace. Vivian carefully examined them and confirmed that the items matched evidence gathered during their own investigation. Rumors claimed that Gale had operated a small stall where he freely handed out talismans like these along with customers' purchases. Kara quietly remarked that she had never received one herself. Vivian guessed that Gale had probably been closing his stall at the time, or that Kara had left too quickly for him to remember. Turning back to the adventurers, Vivian asked whether they were absolutely certain the items had been made by Gale. The man accidentally admitted that he had stolen them before hurriedly correcting himself and claiming that Gale had simply given them to him. As Kara held the accessories in her hands, she was overwhelmed with delight. For a brief moment, she hugged the cursed items with a blissful smile before realizing everyone was staring at her. Composing herself, she calmly stated that their story appeared to contain at least some truth. The party eagerly insisted that everything they had said was true. Kara then instructed Vivian to provide them with an advance payment. Their eyes sparkled with greed as a heavy pouch of coins was handed over. Kara explained that the money was merely in advance because she wished to personally thank Gale. She made it clear that bringing Gale safely to her was now their task. Kneeling proudly, the party leader declared that he would stake his life on accomplishing the mission. After leaving the palace, the group celebrated their unexpected fortune. They discussed the enormous rewards that awaited them and even fantasized about becoming royal retainers. Confident they would locate Gale quickly, they divided the search among themselves. One planned to search merchant stalls, believing Gale might have reopened his business somewhere. Another would investigate the Adventurers Guild and local taverns, convinced Gale would never stray far from familiar places. Another would inspect the city's carriage routes in case Gale had left the capital. They also speculated about why the princess seemed so eager to thank Gale, wondering what connection he might have had with the royal family. Completely misunderstanding her intentions, they laughed among themselves, deciding that once they found Gale, they would thank him in their own way by beating him, turning him over to the palace, and imagining all sorts of cruel punishments awaiting him. Back inside the palace, Vivian quietly asked Kara whether it had really been wise to trust such unpleasant adventurers. Kara admitted that the royal palace itself had failed to locate Gale so far. Looking at the updated wanted poster, she commented that at least the party possessed an S-rank reputation, so she wanted to see what they were capable of. Nevertheless, she instructed Vivian to secretly keep an eye on them. As she studied Gale's name on the poster, Kara gently touched the cursed ring he had unknowingly given her and smiled, eager to meet the mysterious curse crafter and learn more about him. Meanwhile, in the farming town of Farmage, Gale suddenly sneezed and jokingly wondered if one of his fans was talking about his creations. He happily continued refining the cursed sword he had crafted from the sorcerer's blade, enthusiastically listing every improvement he planned to make. By polishing lich rib bones, adding dark skeleton powder, balancing elemental properties, and enhancing the weapon with various talismans, he transformed it into what he proudly named Divide, the great sword of the accursed sage. The finished weapon possessed increased blood effects, stamina-draining abilities, dramatically improved slashing power, stronger magic resistance, lighter weight, and better resistance to dust. Completely absorbed in his work, Gale excitedly talked through every detail aloud. His excitement was abruptly interrupted when Moria entered his room and smacked him, demanding that he stop shouting. Gale asked why she was in his room, only for Moria to point out that her room was directly next door and she had been forced to listen to him ramble day and night. She complained that his room was dark, smelly, and filled with strange materials before opening the window to let fresh air inside. She reminded him that he was supposed to be opening his stall that day and announced that she would accompany him. Since the weather was nice, Gale happily agreed. Later that morning, Gale enthusiastically advertised his cursed merchandise in the middle of the bustling marketplace. While neighboring stalls promoted freshly baked bread, breakfast rice balls, and juicy roasted turkey legs, Gale loudly invited customers to buy cursed weapons and accessories made from fresh, undead materials. He even suggested pairing meals with skeleton chopsticks that could tenderize meat or purchasing cursed swords while shopping for groceries. Every customer either ignored him or recoiled in disgust. Moria watched the scene with growing frustration as Gale failed to understand why no one was interested in cursed equipment during breakfast shopping. She finally confronted him, asking what exactly he thought he was doing. Gale misunderstood completely, assuming she wanted to buy one of his swords, and proudly offered her a discount. Moria grabbed him in exasperation, explaining that he was trying to sell cursed weapons beside food stalls at the busiest breakfast hour. Gale defended himself by saying the Merchants Guild had told him mornings and evenings were the best times for business. Moria sighed and explained that while such advice applied to food vendors, it certainly did not apply to cursed gear. She reminded him that Farmage was a farming town and urged him to think about supply and demand. Gale quietly listed the kinds of cursed tools he believed farmers might want before suddenly suggesting cursed headbands. That suggestion was the last straw, and Moria dragged him away by force while Gale worried that someone might steal his merchandise. She bluntly informed him that everyone was too disgusted to touch it. Soon afterward, they visited the Adventurers Guild, where Gimli greeted them with laughter, remarking that Moria must have a difficult time dealing with a partner like Gale. Both immediately denied being partners in perfect synchronization, prompting Gimli to tease them even more. Gale complained that he had paid the Merchants Guild an entire gold coin for his market stall because they had promised him the busiest location in town. Both Gimli and Moria stared at him in disbelief. Moria asked whether market spaces were really that expensive in Farmage. Gimli immediately explained that he had been completely cheated. Patiently, Gimli explained that successful selling involved far more than simply choosing a crowded location. Farmage's busiest areas mainly serve farmers traveling between their homes and fields. Those customers wanted farming equipment and food, not cursed weapons and undead accessories. Gale looked completely devastated upon realizing he had wasted his money. Gimli reassured him that there was still some demand for cursed gear, especially among adventurers who visited the guild, causing Gale's hope to return. However, she explained that simply waiting there would not solve his problem. He first needed to relocate his stall to a more suitable district. When Gale explained that the Merchants Guild had told him all the better districts were already full, Gimli asked whether he had actually seen them himself. Gale admitted that he and Moria had passed through one of those districts earlier and had noticed plenty of empty space. Moria confirmed that there had indeed been available locations. Smiling knowingly, Gimli finally understood exactly what had happened. She explained that although Farmage was not a huge city, it was large enough for powerful guilds from major cities and the capital to establish local branches. Sensing that something suspicious had occurred, Gimli suddenly announced that the three of them were going out. Moria asked where they were headed, and with a confident smile, Gimli answered that they were going to visit the Smiths Guild. Moria could only stare at her in confusion, wondering what the blacksmiths had to do with any of this. At the start of Chapter 13, Gale asked Gimli why they had come to the Smiths Guild if she was helping him secure a better stall location instead of going to the Merchants Guild. Gimli explained that Farmage had a unique balance of power. The Merchants Guild held very little influence in the town, while the Smiths Guild possessed the greatest authority because it had the largest workforce and the most resources. That was why Gale needed to formally introduce himself to the Smiths Guild first. Moria quickly understood that the Merchants Guild was effectively subordinate to the strongest guild in the city. Gimli praised her sharp thinking, remarking that it suited a support mage. She further explained that in a farming town, metal tools were essential, creating constant demand for smiths who could forge and repair equipment. Since the Smiths Guild had also originated in Farmage, it knew exactly how to create tools suited to the local land and weather, making its influence only natural. Hearing this, Gale assumed that speaking directly with the guildmaster would earn him a stall in one of the better districts. Gimli confirmed that it was possible and asked whether he had prepared a suitable gift. Gale proudly revealed a cursed necklace before pulling out his prize sword, the Divide, convinced that the head of the Smiths Guild would absolutely love it. Gimli visibly shivered while the people nearby recoiled in fear as Gale casually waved the cursed weapon around. Moria immediately grabbed his hair and tried to stop him before he scared everyone. When Gimli asked about the sword, Moria finally realized why Gimli had insisted they purchase ordinary gifts from the marketplace beforehand. She declared that she would carry the presents herself, while Gale only needed to bow politely and behave. Gale could not understand why. insisting that any smith would surely appreciate how impressive his sword was. Moria doubted that confidence and told him to look around, where the people inside the guild hall were already hiding at the sight of the weapon. Gimli pushed open the entrance, revealing an enormous workshop filled with smiths tirelessly hammering glowing metal. The entire building echoed with the sounds of forging. Moria immediately complained about the unbearable heat, while Gale's eyes sparkled with fascination. Looking around, Moria wondered where the reception counter was, but Gimli explained that although it was called a guild, it was really nothing more than a massive forge where all the smiths worked together. As a man squeezed past them carrying materials, Gale politely apologized while quietly marveling at how intensely hot the place was. Unsure of the proper procedure, Gale asked whether they could simply walk in uninvited. Gimli casually replied that a loud shout would be enough to summon the guildmaster. Moria cleared her throat and called out as loudly as she could, but her voice disappeared beneath the constant pounding of hammers. Gimli remarked that it was far too quiet and demonstrated how it should be done. Taking a deep breath, she unleashed an incredibly loud shout that echoed throughout the forge as she called for Sharana. Gale and Moria were both stunned by the sheer volume. Almost immediately, a door burst open and a massive hammer came flying toward them with a thunderous crash. A voice angrily demanded to know how many times that month people intended to wake her so early before ordering everyone to keep the noise down. The owner of the voice was Sharana herself, who complained that she had heard them the first time and called them a bunch of idiots. Moria was surprised to discover that the guild master was a dwarf, while Gale was equally surprised that the dwarf was a woman. Gimli laughed, pointing out that Sharana had ignored the first call. Sharana recognized Gimli immediately and mocked her for being the dark elf who hid away in a gloomy forest. Gimli fired back by calling Sharana a cave-dwelling shut-in. Sharana warned her not to start anything. Watching the exchange, Moria quietly whispered to Gale that perhaps elves and dwarves truly did not get along and wondered if Gimli had brought them to the wrong person. Gimli assured her that everything was perfectly normal and promised to support them until the end. She introduced Sharana as the guild master of the Smiths Guild, adding a teasing remark about her personality. Sharana greeted them despite immediately responding to Gimli's insult. Sharana shook Gale's hand. Gale carefully examined her rough palms. They were much larger than expected for her size, heavily calloused, covered in tiny cuts from grinding metal, and marked by thick, furnace-tanned skin. Every detail spoke of countless years spent working the forge. Before Moria could interrupt, Gale and Sharana found themselves silently studying one another with mutual respect. Both recognized the other as a fellow craftsman who had devoted themselves entirely to their trade. Gimli jokingly asked why the two of them were staring at each other so intensely. Gale immediately denied it, while Sharana insisted that nothing strange was happening. Moria frowned while Gimli only smirked. Bringing the conversation back on track, Gimli introduced Gale as a newcomer from the capital who wished to open a stall in farmage and had come to greet the guildmaster properly. Sharana reacted indifferently, saying Gale was free to open a stall wherever he wanted because she had been overwhelmed with work since early that morning due to a severe material shortage. She wondered why they had come to waste even more of her time. However, she privately realized that if Gale simply opened a stall without informing anyone, it could create unnecessary problems between the Smiths Guild and the Merchants Guild. She explained that although her guild had never intended to control the town, years of repairing tools and equipment had naturally made them an important part of the local community. Unlike the capital, where people often threw things away and bought replacements, farmage valued repairing and maintaining what they already owned. That gradual trust had eventually placed Sharana in a position of effectively leading the town. Taking a seat, Sharana asked Gale for his name and advised him not to take everything Gimli said too seriously. In her opinion, whenever Gimli spoke, people should treat her words with a healthy amount of skepticism. Gimli complained that Sharana was being unfair, but Sharana ignored her and agreed to prepare the necessary paperwork. Gale thanked her immediately, while Moria excitedly celebrated that everything had worked out. The two of them even exchanged a high five. Sharana quickly stopped their celebration, warning them that she had never promised to make things easy. Gale was confused, but Sharana explained that nobody ran a charity. If they wanted her approval, they would need to show sincerity equal to the favor they were requesting. Moria immediately stepped forward and presented a bottle of hard liquor as a gift. Sharana smiled, clearly appreciating it. Gale enthusiastically announced that he had brought a gift of his own and immediately reached for the divide, convinced Sharana would love it. Moria instantly shoved him aside before he could present it, insisting that this was not the time for his personal art exhibition. She even slapped him to stop him from insisting. Sharana jokingly remarked that Moria certainly did not hesitate to slap Gale whenever necessary. However, before the argument could continue, Sharana suddenly froze. Her eyes widened as she noticed the partially open bag Gale was carrying. Curious, she walked over and examined it closely. Watching the two craftsmen gather around the bag, Gimli quietly commented that the crafting enthusiasts were at it again. Sharana carefully lifted the sword and immediately declared it extraordinary. She could tell at a glance that it was far from an ordinary weapon. Gale lit up with excitement upon hearing someone recognize its quality. Sharana told him to drop the formal titles and simply call her by name. Gale happily agreed, praising her expertise and admitting that it felt wonderful to finally meet someone who truly appreciated his work. Overcome with emotion, he even shed a tear. Sharana smiled as she held the sword while Moria watched the scene with growing irritation. When Moria awkwardly cleared her throat, Gale innocently asked whether she had caught a cold. Gimli only smirked knowingly while Moria denied anything was wrong. Sharana suggested that perhaps the forge was simply too dusty and offered to let Moria wait outside, but Moria admitted that the real problem was how quickly Gale and Sharana had become so close. Neither of them understood what she meant. Filled with excitement, Gale praised Sharana as someone truly worthy of leading the Smiths Guild because she immediately understood the value of his work. Sharana explained that she was a smith herself and carefully examined the blade under the light of the forge. She recognized that its foundation came from a rare monster drop and praised the craftsmanship. She accurately identified many of its enchantments, including Bloodsucker, enhanced slashing power, and dark element attributes. Gale enthusiastically complimented her keen eye, but proudly revealed that there were still more hidden effects. Sharana eagerly continued analyzing it herself, correctly identifying its lightweight enhancement as well. As she casually swung the blade around, Moria nervously pointed out that Sharana was already testing it. Gale simply replied that any true craftsman would naturally want to experience such a masterpiece firsthand. Sharana admired how the sword allowed its wielder to recover stamina by absorbing an enemy's blood, while remaining light enough to wield comfortably despite its size. She remarked that it would be perfect for frontline adventurers and even suitable for solo adventurers because of its many useful effects. Gale happily added that it also possessed enhanced magical resistance and even dust-proofing to make maintenance easier. Finally, he proudly mentioned that the weapon was cursed and looked incredibly cool. Sharana enthusiastically praised the practical features, but suddenly paused after hearing the final detail. Realizing what Gale had just said, she looked down in horror and discovered that she could no longer let go of the sword. Moria sighed in exasperation as Sharana panicked over the familiar problem. Gale seemed more offended that Sharana disliked the sword's appearance than concerned about the curse itself. Furious, Sharana called him an idiot and declared that the sword was terrible after all. Moria urged Sharana to calm down while asking Gale to remove the curse. Gale stubbornly complained that the sword was still amazing, prompting Moria to shout at him once again. Gimli laughed openly as the room descended into complete chaos, with everyone desperately trying to free Sharana from the cursed weapon. As the commotion continued, Gimli quietly reflected that despite the curse, Sharana had praised every other aspect of the weapon without hesitation. Gale's abilities far exceeded those of an ordinary curse crafter. Perhaps he truly possessed the talent necessary for something much greater. Shaking the thought away, she watched as Sharana finally managed to free herself after Gale removed the curse. Sharana sighed with relief and blew on her sore hand while calling the entire incident a disaster. Moria apologized on Gale's behalf, reminding Sharana that she had warned him in advance. Sharana disinfected her hand and firmly told Gale that if an item was cursed, he should always say so before handing it to anyone because that was the most important information. Gale honestly admitted that he had never considered it important since he could simply dispel the curse whenever he wanted. Sharana immediately pointed out that the world did not revolve around him, and that ordinary people could not rely on his personal abilities. Turning toward Gimli, Sharana wondered how she managed to deal with troublesome people like Gale and Moria. Gimli calmly replied that Gale had never intended any harm. Sharana complained that she had foolishly picked up the sword because its many useful features had distracted her from its terrible appearance and hidden curse. She flatly declared that Gale had no business opening a stall. Gale protested that she had accepted all of their gifts, but Moria reminded him that the only gift Sharana had actually accepted was the liquor she had purchased herself. Sharana admitted that she could barely appreciate even that anymore after disinfecting her hands and joked that she was only breaking even in the entire exchange. If she were less patient, she would have already called the guards. Gale sadly remarked that he had worked incredibly hard on the sword. Sharana demanded to know whether he had ever heard of something called customer needs before answering her own question by concluding that he clearly had not. There was absolutely no way she would allow someone like Gale to sell cursed equipment throughout Farmage. He had apparently already filled the capital with his strange creations, and she refused to let the same happen there. Still, after thinking about it, Sharna admitted that she was not completely heartless. She asked Gale whether he truly wanted to open a stall that badly. Gale confidently answered yes, only to receive another painful pinch from Moria. This time, Gale humbly bowed and sincerely begged Sharna for permission. Moria also pleaded on his behalf, explaining that Gale simply thought differently from most people. Despite his terrible design sense, he was an exceptional dispeller and an extremely talented craftsman. Sharna admitted that seeing Moria defend him so earnestly made her reconsider, but she reminded them that recommending someone to the Merchants Guild also meant accepting responsibility for that recommendation. She asked Gale whether he understood that responsibility, and he immediately answered yes. Sharna replied that words alone were not enough, and that she wanted to judge their character for herself first. When Moria assumed this meant paying money, Sharna dismissed the idea, saying she had no intention of taking advantage of newcomers. Instead, she had a favor she wanted to ask. Curious, Gale asked what kind of favor she had in mind. Sharna challenged him to guess what sort of request a guild master might make to adventurers. She explained that there was a mine called Doghowl Mine, the only mine located near Farmage. Everyone who entered had disappeared without a trace, and nobody even knew what kind of monsters were responsible. The mission was to eliminate the threat and make the mine safe again. Because of the unknown danger and the number of disappearances, it had been designated as a AA rank quest. Sharna finally asked whether Gale and Moria were willing to accept the mission. At the beginning of Chapter 14, inside the castle, Kara questioned what the old Chamberlain had meant by his report. She had assumed that the attackers were merely a band of thugs pretending to serve the Empire, but she was stunned to learn that the Empire itself was truly involved. Vivian confirmed that the Imperial authorities had finally forced the captured assassins to reveal the truth, leaving little room for doubt. Kara remarked that Vivian seemed to mean that quite literally. The old man agreed and explained that, in short, the attempt on Kara's life was connected to the Empire's ongoing succession struggle. The assassins had been hired by the Crown Prince in an effort to eliminate her. According to the information they had gathered, the Emperor had fallen gravely ill, and the Empire had become divided between the first and second princes. Although the Crown Prince was the son of a concubine, the second prince was the Emperor's legitimate heir. Unable to understand why she had become involved, Kara asked what any of it had to do with her. Vivian admitted that there was nothing Kara could do directly at the moment, but reminded her that the king had already chosen her as the second prince's political bride. Kara remembered the arrangement, but insisted that she had never agreed to it herself. The Chamberlain reluctantly explained that, as her servant, he disliked saying it, but the engagement was an official agreement between two nations and therefore existed beyond Kara's personal wishes. Vivian concluded that the attackers were almost certainly supporters of the Crown Prince who opposed the marriage. If the second prince married Kara, the alliance between their kingdoms would strengthen his political standing while weakening the Crown Prince's position. Those loyal to the Crown Prince had every reason to prevent that from happening. If the assassination were traced back to the Empire and diplomatic relations collapsed, the Crown Prince would likely welcome the outcome. With the Empire already divided by internal conflict, they expected two likely developments. First, the second prince would probably travel to their kingdom on a goodwill mission to repair relations. Second, another assassination attempt would almost certainly follow. Kara was horrified to hear that more attacks were expected. Vivian explained that although they had extracted confessions from the captured assassins, they still lacked direct proof tying the Crown Prince himself to the plot. If the Empire denied responsibility, their kingdom could do little more than file an official protest. Unless they intended to start a war, which they were not prepared for, the matter could not be pursued much further. Frustrated, Princess Kara slammed both hands onto the table and declared that the marriage had to be cancelled. She insisted that she would never marry the second prince. Immediately afterward, she rose from her seat, threw herself on her bed, and buried her face in the blankets. Vivian reminded her that an international agreement could not simply be revoked. Kara complained bitterly that she hated the arrangement, and even lamented that she already had a perfectly good ring. Meanwhile, outside Farmage at Doghowl Mine, Gale confirmed once more that he was a curse crafter, while Mora introduced herself as a support mage. Gimli remarked that her own role was irrelevant because she was not part of the party. Gale questioned whether Gimli should simply hire a different group instead. Both he and Mora specialized as rear-line fighters, while Gimli would not even be accompanying them. Sharna reminded everyone that they had already discussed the situation. There simply was no other party available, which was exactly why the request had remained unsolved for so long. Under normal circumstances, it would have only been a B or C rank quest. Sharna insisted that since they had already come all the way there, they should simply accept the challenge and finish the job. Gale and Mora pointed out that they had only just arrived in town. Smiling, Gimli reminded Sharona that she herself had once explained how a quest's difficulty rating increased the longer it remained unfinished. Sharona protested that the ranking system had been something the two of them had established together and complained that Gimli should stop making her sound unreasonable. Mora finally understood the situation. Since no one had completed the quest for such a long time, its difficulty had eventually been raised to AA rank. Gale wondered whether failing again would make it even higher. Gimli laughed and admitted that it could even reach S rank. Mora failed to see anything amusing about that possibility. Gimli explained that many adventurers had disappeared after accepting the quest. Looking toward the cave entrance, Mora guessed that this must be the reason. The howling wind echoed from within, but she was convinced there were also terrifying monsters lurking deeper inside. Both she and Gale shivered uneasily. Sharona mocked them for acting so frightened. She argued that if they truly called themselves adventurers, they should charge inside and complete the mission. Without reopening the mine, the town would be forced to keep importing or forever. Gale reminded her that everyone who had entered the mine before had never returned. Mora agreed after reading the request details and also noticed that the reward was only 10 gold, an amount she considered far too low. Sharona explained that the reward had originally been set for an easy quest and had never been adjusted. Mora remarked that it was no surprise the local adventurers refused to touch it. Gale admitted that without a proper frontline fighter, he did not believe they could safely continue. Mora pointed out that Gale had recently defeated both a sorcerer and an entire undead army by himself. Gale answered that undead creatures were completely different. Facing an unknown monster without any information was far more dangerous. Frustrated, Sharona complained that people from the city were far too timid. She then volunteered herself to serve as the party's frontline fighter. Confused, Gale and Mora stared at her. Since she had already planned to guide them through the mine, Sharona saw no reason why she could not fight alongside them as well. Even Gimli admitted that, aside from the unusual arrangement of having the client fight on the front lines, there was technically nothing wrong with the idea. Gale and Mora were surprised by her response. Sharona proudly flexed her muscles and assured them that she could certainly handle herself. Mora admitted that Sharona definitely looked strong enough, while Gale cautiously asked whether she truly could protect the party. Sharona confidently declared that she was more than capable. Looking over the group, Mora reflected that they made an incredibly strange party consisting of a curse crafter, a support mage, and a blacksmith. Despite how unbalanced they appeared, she did not think their chances were hopeless. With Gale's unusual curses, perhaps they could overcome even an enemy they knew nothing about. Sharona enthusiastically declared that the quest had officially begun. Mora confidently stated that they would finish the mission quickly before helping Gale establish his market stall in the better part of town. Gale, however, remained uncertain, reminding himself that this place was not another crypt. Gimli waved goodbye as the three entered the mine. Almost immediately after stepping inside, a strange howling echoed through the tunnels. Startled, Gale asked about the unsettling sound. Mora regretted rushing into the cave without better preparation. Sharona casually reassured them that if no monsters were present, the mine was practically as familiar to her as her own backyard. Gale was surprised by the comparison. Sharona explained that several ventilation shafts had been dug throughout the mountain. Whenever wind flowed through them, it produced the eerie sound of a dog howling, which was exactly how the mine had earned its name. She then showed them several rocks scattered nearby and tossed one to Mora. Examining it closely, Mora realized it was iron ore. Sharona proudly explained that the mine also occasionally produced lead and even mithril. Looking around, she encouraged them to appreciate what a wonderful mine it truly was. Gale and Mora examined the enormous cavern and were amazed by the countless mineral deposits embedded throughout the walls and ceiling. Sharona explained that she had established her forge there because of the mountain's valuable resources. The mine was deeply important to her, and she asked them to stop treating it like a cursed place. Realizing her mistake, Mora apologized, admitting that the mine did not resemble a crypt at all. There were no undead in sight, and seemingly no reason to be afraid. That confidence vanished instantly when Mora accidentally bumped into something. Looking up, she found herself staring directly into a human face and screamed in terror, believing she had encountered an undead creature. Sharona looked around in confusion, insisting that she saw no monsters. Gale, however, became unexpectedly excited, reasoning that if an undead really existed there, it must be an unusually powerful one. Upon closer inspection, Gale realized the frightening figure was merely an incredibly lifelike stone statue. Sharona admired the extraordinary craftsmanship, remarking that it almost appeared alive. Gale examined it himself and praised it as a remarkable work of art. Mora sighed in disbelief at how easily the two craftsmen became distracted by artistic details. Sharona wondered what kind of genius could have created such realistic sculptures. As Mora turned away, she noticed another chamber beyond a nearby doorway. Calling the others over, she tried to get their attention, but Sharona and Gale remained focused on admiring the statue. Frustrated, Mora dragged them toward the newly discovered room. When they finally looked inside, they were stunned. The chamber was filled with statues, dozens upon dozens of them. Every single one depicted a different person. Sharona initially believed they were simply more sculptures, while Gale noted that none of them looked alike. Mora sensed that something was terribly wrong and feared they were in serious danger. Sharona approached one of the figures for a closer look before suddenly freezing in shock. She recognized the face. Pointing at several others, she realized she knew them as well. Every one of them had once been an adventurer from Farmage. Horrified, they realized that these were not ordinary statues at all. The missing adventurers had been transformed into stone while still alive. Gale grimly remarked that their incredible realism now made perfect sense. Sharona struggled to understand why so many people had been petrified. Gale answered that only a monster could have caused something like this. Instantly, all three realized the terrible truth. Mora immediately ordered everyone to stay alert. She moved to watch the exit while instructing Gale and Sharona to cover the front and the sides. Gale admitted that he had an awful feeling about the situation. Only a handful of monsters possessed the power to petrify living beings, and every one of them ranked at least A-class or higher. At first, they considered creatures such as basilisks or gorgons, but Gale quickly dismissed those possibilities after noticing the strong smell, the massive feathers scattered throughout the cavern, and the unmistakable signs of petrification. The evidence pointed to only one possibility. Their enemy was a cockatrice. Without warning, a loud crash echoed through the cavern before a gigantic creature suddenly appeared. It possessed the body of an enormous chicken with a serpent emerging from behind it. Across many regions, a cockatrice was classified as a disaster-class monster. Its natural defenses could repel most projectile attacks, while its razor-sharp claws, deadly poison, petrifying breath, speed, intelligence, and tactical instincts made it one of the most feared monsters imaginable. Mora realized too late that the creature had attacked from behind, instantly reversing their formation and leaving their rear exposed. Sharona cursed as their front and back lines became completely disorganized. Gale desperately shouted for Mora to retreat. Without hesitation, he rushed forward to protect her, placing himself directly in front of the charging cockatrice. At the beginning of Chapter 15, Gale charged straight toward the cockatrice with several sharp cursed darts in his hand. As he advanced, the snake attached to the monster struck at him. Gale immediately leaped backward while throwing one of his darts. The projectile exploded upon impact and pierced the cockatrice's tough hide. Gale observed that the creature had rushed at him with its beak wide open, making it an easy target. Sharona was astonished that the dart had penetrated the cockatrice's thick scales. She also could not understand why the monster's paralysis had failed to affect Gale. Considering the cockatrice was stronger than the boss of most ordinary dungeons, the result seemed impossible. Gale brushed aside the questions and urged everyone to attack immediately. He explained that the dart was only a disposable item carrying a stun effect and a curse that temporarily removed armor. Those status effects would not last very long. Without hesitation, Sharona rushed forward with her enormous hammer. She unleashed her mock hammer technique, striking the cockatrice repeatedly while still airborne. Mora counted 5 consecutive mid-air blows, while Gale watched as Sharona's final strike sent the monster's head flying. Sharona proudly celebrated her performance, but the battle was not over. The snake attached to the cockatrice suddenly opened its jaws and lunged upward from below, threatening to catch Sharona off guard. Gale immediately called for Mora's assistance. Mora responded at once, releasing a burst of magic that surrounded Sharona. Sharona immediately felt a tremendous surge of strength. Mora explained that it was a rapid, muscle-enhancing spell designed for immediate use, although its effects would not last very long. Satisfied with the temporary enhancement, Sharona drove her hammer vertically into the snake's open mouth, forcing its jaws apart. She reached inside, seized the creature's jaw with her bare hands, and demonstrated the overwhelming physical strength of a master blacksmith. With a powerful pull, she tore the snake's jaws completely apart, ripping its body open from mouth to torso and splitting it cleanly in half. Laughing triumphantly, she claimed the victory as her own. Mora remarked that the situation had been dangerously close. They had only survived because the cockatrice had moved much more slowly than normal, undoubtedly due to Gale's cursed dart still taking effect. Once again, she found herself questioning Gale's bizarre cursed equipment. Sharona agreed, wondering how a simple one-use item containing stun and armor reduction could affect a boss-class monster. She had never heard of such a thing before. Gale explained that there was nothing unusual about it from his perspective. He had simply attached a talisman crafted from the ashes of a ghost-like creature he had encountered in the capital. The stun property came from the spirit itself, while the armor-negating effect originated from the ghost's ability to pass through solid walls. Neither Mora nor Sharina understood his explanation. Sharina questioned why a ghost would possess an ability that translated into ignoring armor. Gale struggled to remember the exact details, but described the creature as resembling a large skeleton hidden beneath a black cloak. After thinking for a moment, Mora wondered if it happened to carry a scythe, while Sharina added that it might also have carried an old lantern. Gale suddenly realized which creature they meant, and casually confirmed that it was indeed the enormous skeleton capable of passing through walls. Both women immediately recognized the description. It was a Grim Reaper, a disaster-class monster known as the Reaper of Souls, a demigod-like being that almost never appeared in the outside world. Completely unfazed, Gale remarked that the creature had never seemed particularly impressive. He had encountered many of them while exploring crypts, although their habit of emerging from walls had startled him the first few times. Before he could continue, Mora grabbed him in disbelief. She demanded to know how he had survived encounters with demigod-class monsters. Gale answered matter-of-factly that he had simply dispelled them and turned them into cursed equipment. Mora stared at him speechlessly before finally realizing why his cursed items were so effective. He had transformed disaster-class monsters into disaster-class equipment, making it perfectly reasonable that such gear could affect even boss-class creatures. Sharina found herself wondering just who Gale truly was. Gale calmly advised Sharina to be more careful in future battles. Even a brief lapse in concentration could cost someone their life. According to him, every adventurer who accepted dangerous quests lived by that principle. Sharina admitted that she had come dangerously close to dying, but argued that anyone would have relaxed their guard after believing the battle was already won. She also insisted there would not be another opportunity to make the same mistake. As everyone relaxed, Mora suddenly realized something and turned back toward the fallen cockatrice. Gale happily declared that Doghowl Mine was finally safe again and that the AA ranked quest had been completed. He immediately began collecting the cockatrice's feathers while mentioning that they should also report the rescue of the petrified adventurers to Gimli. Most importantly, the mine could finally be used again. Sharina agreed that the evidence was obvious. The cockatrice had clearly been responsible for all of the disappearances, and with it defeated, the mine was once again safe. She jokingly remarked that perhaps she had become a true adventurer herself after this experience. Gale simply nodded in agreement. Curious, Gale called out to Mora and admitted that this was his first time encountering a cockatrice during a quest. He wondered whether the monster tasted good. Mora replied that she had no interest in finding out and only wanted to collect proof of the kill. She questioned whether Gale had seriously considered eating a creature whose entire body was filled with deadly poison. Gale seemed disappointed, remarking that it looked so much like an ordinary chicken. Mora then wondered why such a massive monster had chosen to live inside a relatively small mine. As she prepared to cut the body apart, Gale observed that the cave seemed far too cramped for an adult cockatrice. Perhaps, he suggested, the creature had simply been using the mine as a giant nest. After all, monsters rarely behaved in ways humans could fully understand. As Gale examined the surroundings more closely, he noticed that the cave smelled strongly of a chicken coop, filled with the odors of droppings and rotten eggs. Suddenly, he heard a cracking sound and asked whether Mora had stepped on something. Looking down, Mora discovered a large broken eggshell. Although she initially identified it as an eggshell, its enormous size immediately struck both of them as unusual. Gale began wondering aloud what exactly chicken coops were used for. Before anyone could answer, Sharina suddenly noticed something that made her panic. Mora explained that chicken coops existed because hens laid eggs there. The realization struck everyone at once. Sharina cursed loudly as an unfamiliar chirping echoed through the cavern. The sound quickly grew louder until a gigantic chick, complete with its own snake tail, emerged from the darkness. It was not alone. Countless baby cockatrices began pouring toward them from every direction. Sharina urged everyone to flee as quickly as possible, warning that she would not be responsible if they were swallowed whole. The swarm of baby cockatrices relentlessly pursued them until Mora suddenly discovered that they had reached a dead end. Sharina realized that this section of the mine had likely been sealed off. Gale asked what they were supposed to do next. Sharina immediately made a decision. She would stand at the front and hold back the monsters while Gale and Mora protected her from behind. As the chicks charged closer, Sharina swung her hammer with tremendous force, smashing several of them aside. She struck again, proudly declaring that her hammer was powerful enough to shatter solid stone. Unfortunately, the remaining chicks continued advancing without hesitation. Mora asked Sharona to endure just a little longer. Sharona assured her that she could manage. Watching the endless wave of monsters, Mora realized that this situation was even more dangerous than fighting the adult cockatrice. Each hatchling was already larger than an average human, and there appeared to be well over 100 of them. She could hardly believe that a bird could produce such an enormous number of offspring, although perhaps the snake half contributed to its unusual reproductive abilities. The hatchlings also posed another problem. They possessed the same violent instincts as their mother and were obviously starving. Had they been fully grown adults, killing a few might have frightened the rest into retreating. These newborn creatures, however, possessed no such caution or judgment. They cared only about devouring whatever stood before them. Sharona continued crushing one chick after another, loudly counting each defeat as she fought. Despite her confidence, the endless stream of enemies quickly became overwhelming, and she found herself wishing they would finally stop coming. At last, Mora announced that her preparations were complete. She cast an advanced enhancement spell that continuously strengthened its target as long as magical energy flowed into it. Sharona immediately felt another surge of power, far greater than the earlier muscle enhancement. Unlike the previous spell, this one continued growing stronger over time. Although the increase was gradual, it soon granted Sharona enough strength to defeat each baby cockatrice with a single blow. Mora also enhanced Sharona's agility before increasing every other combat-related attribute she possessed. Empowered by Mora's support magic, Sharona transformed into an unstoppable force. Her hammer spun like a raging tornado, pulverizing every baby cockatrice caught in its path. The magical enhancements dramatically increased her speed, strength, offense, and defense, making her seem almost invincible. Even so, the sheer number of hatchlings became a serious problem. Sharona admitted that both her stamina and her sanity were reaching their limits. Mora confessed that she was nearly exhausted as well. Desperately searching for another solution, she called to Gale and asked whether he possessed any curses capable of wiping out large groups of monsters, similar to those he had previously used against the orcs. Gale sadly explained that he had already used up those particular cursed items long ago. More importantly, they would not work against baby cockatrices. Spirit-based curses relied on influencing a target's mind, and creatures with almost no sense of self were largely unaffected. Confused, Sharona asked him to explain further. Gale compared curses to showing someone a lemon in order to trigger the instinctive reaction of salivating. That method worked only if the target already understood what a lemon was. A baby with no such knowledge would not respond at all. Likewise, mental curses such as terror or disguises that manipulated the spirit functioned only against monsters with sufficient intelligence. Unlike the enemies they had faced on previous quests, these newborn cockatrices lacked the awareness required for Gale's curses to have any meaningful effect. At the beginning of Chapter 16, the loud chirping of the baby cockatrices continued to echo throughout the mine. Sharona stood at the front, clearly exhausted after fighting off countless hatchlings. Realizing they could not continue much longer, Mora asked Gale whether he possessed any cursed equipment that could strengthen an ally instead of weakening an enemy. Gale searched through his tool bag and found several cursed items that he had originally intended to sell as decorative pieces. Among them were a cursed bandana, a darkness mask, and the horns of lamentation. Although he was proud of their craftsmanship, he insisted that they had been made as decorations rather than practical battle equipment. Sharona muttered that they were as good as dead anyway, while Gale explained that the equipment did not possess especially powerful effects. According to him, the set merely granted abilities such as triple defense, doubled agility, fatigue resistance, poison resistance, and similar enhancements. Upon hearing those effects, Sharona immediately declared that they were exactly what the party needed. Mora quickly began constructing a magical barrier to buy them time, urging Sharona to hurry before it collapsed. As the barrier held back the advancing chicks, Sharona pushed Gale aside and grabbed the cursed equipment herself. Gale warned her not to expect too much since the items were never intended for real combat. Holding the cursed bandana in her hands, Sharona noticed its strange organic texture and found it rather disgusting. Even so, she convinced herself to wear it because its defensive abilities were too valuable to ignore. Gale explained that the bandana granted triple defense along with fatigue resistance. The moment she put on, cursed magic flowed throughout her body. Sharona was amazed as the exhaustion weighing down her body seemed to disappear completely. Gale then handed her the darkness mask, explaining that it granted poison immunity while allowing the wearer to see perfectly even in darkness. Sharona realized he had not exaggerated its abilities. Looking deeper into the mine, She could now clearly see even more baby cockatrices approaching. Mora, meanwhile, looked thoroughly disturbed by the mask's grotesque appearance and warned that the barrier was about to fail, urging them to finish equipping the remaining item. Finally, Gale presented the Horns of Lamentation. He explained that they doubled the wearer's agility while increasing arm strength by 5 times. Sharona could hardly believe such an effect was possible. Once she equipped the horns, Gale's cursed equipment formed a complete armor set. Looking over at Gale, she noticed the satisfied expression on his face and wondered why he looked so smug. Although Sharona initially doubted the impossible increase in strength, she immediately felt overwhelming power coursing through every part of her body, all the way to her fingertips. Before she could fully process the sensation, Mora's barrier shattered, allowing the swarm of baby cockatrices to rush toward them. Mora shouted a warning as the monsters broke through and charged from behind. Sharona lifted her massive hammer and smashed the approaching hatchlings with a single tremendous swing. The force of the blow shook the entire mine. Mora realized that her own enhancement spells had already expired, yet Sharona's strength continued to exceed everything she had shown earlier. Filled with excitement, Sharona declared that the equipment was incredible. She felt completely invincible. Inspired by her overwhelming power, she even invented a new attack on the spot. Swinging her hammer with wild enthusiasm, she unleashed what she called Eternal Smash while laughing uncontrollably. Watching her behavior, Mora wondered whether the cursed equipment itself had affected Sharona's mind. Gale shook his head and explained that it was simply the combined effect of wearing multiple compatible cursed items. When certain cursed equipment was worn together, their curses reacted with one another like a chemical reaction, producing effects far greater than each individual item could achieve. The Horns of Lamentation and the Darkness Mask were one such compatible combination. Mora realized that Sharona's condition went far beyond simply resisting fatigue. It resembled the euphoric state athletes sometimes experienced after intense exertion, except amplified through curses instead of natural biology. With renewed strength, Sharona crushed the final baby cockatrice beneath her hammer. Blood spread across the stone floor as the last hatchling fell. Seeing that the battle had ended, Gale dispelled the cursed equipment she was wearing. Sharona immediately sighed in relief after the cursed gear disappeared. She admitted that she would have been too embarrassed to return to Farmage while dressed in such bizarre equipment. Gale seemed offended, reminding her that she had praised the gear only moments earlier. Sharona clarified that she had admired its abilities, not its appearance. Examining the equipment, Gale remarked that it had suffered considerable wear during the battle. Sharona jokingly argued that having such a beautiful woman wear the gear had only increased its value. However, almost immediately afterward, her body lost its strength. Her balance gave way, and she collapsed onto the floor, unable to understand why every muscle suddenly ached. Gale explained that fatigue resistance did not actually erase exhaustion. The curse merely tricked the body into believing it was not tired. During the battle, Sharona had fought an entire swarm of baby cockatrices while possessing 5 times her normal arm strength and double her usual agility. Now that the equipment had been removed, her body was finally experiencing the full consequences of that strain. He further explained that while the curse gear had granted poison resistance, removing it meant that any poison already present inside her wounds would begin affecting her normally once again. Pain spread throughout her body as the delayed exhaustion and injuries caught up with her all at once. Sharona groaned in disbelief upon learning the truth. Mora reflected that very few people were eccentric enough to willingly wear cursed equipment. Because of that, curse crafters like Gale were often dismissed as craftsmen with useless professions. Yet after witnessing cursed equipment defeat both an adult cockatrice and an entire swarm of its offspring, she realized its true value was extraordinary. Ironically, Gale himself still seemed completely unaware of just how remarkable his creations actually were. Gale reassured Sharona that the soreness would gradually disappear if she simply rested. Sharona gave up entirely and sprawled across the cave floor. Mora teasingly questioned what had happened to the embarrassment Sharona had felt earlier. Sharona admitted that she no longer possessed enough strength to even stand. Mora confessed that she had also exhausted nearly all of her magical energy and would need considerable time to recover. Gale admitted that he had used up a large amount of his cursed equipment as well. Even so, everyone agreed that this time they were absolutely certain the mission was finished. Doghowl Mine was finally safe again, and the AA rank quest had truly been completed. Looking back on everything that had happened, Mora admitted that had she known the mine contained an entire cockatrice nest, she never would have accepted the quest in the first place. Gale agreed, joking that if he had possessed such foresight, he would have happily settled for keeping his old market stall. Sharona laughed and said that she would never have joined the expedition either if she had known the truth beforehand. As they rested, however, Gale suddenly remembered the enormous eggshell they had found earlier. An uneasy feeling returned to him. Something about the situation still did not make sense. Moments later, heavy footsteps echoed through the mine. A gigantic rooster-like creature appeared from the darkness and slowly approached them. Gale immediately understood what had happened. The first monster they had defeated had been the mother. After killing both her and all of her chicks, the father had finally returned. Realizing the horrifying truth, Gale concluded that the nest had belonged to two adult cockatrices all along. That explained why every previous group of adventurers had failed so completely. Sharana stared at the newcomer in disbelief. It was far larger than the female they had already defeated. As the enormous cockatrice charged toward them, Gale grimly remarked that the battle had entered its third round. Mora could only reject the idea in despair, unable to imagine fighting another one. Despite her complete exhaustion, Sharana tightened her grip on her hammer and cursed the monstrous bird. She reminded everyone that the creature would show them no mercy simply because they were tired. Around them, stones began crumbling beneath the monster's tremendous weight. Sharana realized that the male cockatrice had likely returned carrying food for its young, only to discover that both its mate and offspring had been slaughtered. Naturally, it had been driven into an uncontrollable rage. The giant rooster let out a furious crow that echoed throughout the mine. Even so, Sharana angrily insisted that the monster had no right to act as though it owned the place. The mine belonged to the Smith's Guild, not to some oversized bird. The enormous cockatrice suddenly pulled back its head before releasing a thick cloud of strange mist from its beak. Gale froze as he watched it spread through the air. A terrible premonition gripped him. He immediately dashed towards Sharana, shouting for her to get down. Sharana continued glaring defiantly at the monster, refusing to back away, but Gale reached her just in time and tackled her to the ground. Moments later, everything touched by the drifting mist turned to solid stone with a sharp cracking sound. Gale realized that he was witnessing the infamous petrifying breath he had only heard described in stories. Anything caught within the mist instantly became stone. That was the horrifying ability responsible for transforming all of the missing adventurers into statues. The giant cockatrice inhaled once more before preparing a second blast of petrifying breath. Gale, Sharana, and Mora quickly fled as another wave of deadly mist swept through the tunnel. While retreating, Mora observed that the monster's petrifying breath, fortunately, had only a limited range and required a noticeable delay before it could be used again. Unfortunately, they were trapped inside a narrow, enclosed mine with nowhere to escape. They had reached a dead end. As Gale and Sharana distracted the enraged cockatrice, Mora desperately searched for some strategy that might save them. Just then, Gale and Sharana made a sharp turn and sprinted back toward her at full speed, forcing Mora to shout at them as the enormous monster continued its relentless pursuit. At the beginning of Chapter 17, Mora realized that the enormous rooster cockatrice had driven them all the way into a corner of the mine. Gale admitted that he had expected exactly that. As they searched for an escape, the giant snake attached to the cockatrice lunged toward them. Before they could react, the force of its attack sent all three of them flying across the cavern floor. The rooster then closed its eyes and prepared another blast of its petrifying breath. The three quickly looked around in desperation. All of the stone pillars that had previously protected them had already been destroyed. They needed some sort of shield, but there was nothing left. Sharana's hammer had been knocked far away, and even a nearby minecart had been crushed flat. Despite the hopeless situation, Sharana calmly declared that she already had shield. Gale and Mora looked at her in confusion. Sharana simply spread her arms wide and told them to stand behind her. She insisted that she could protect them if they stayed within her shadow. Gale could not understand what she was planning. Sharana reminded him that she had promised from the very beginning that she would serve as the party's frontline fighter. Now it was their turn to trust her. Before Gale could stop her, the petrifying mist reached Sharana, and her body slowly began turning into stone. As cracks spread across her body, Gale watched in horror. Sharana smiled despite her fate and admitted that although Gale was unlike anyone she had ever met, she somehow could not dislike him. She begged him to use her petrified body as a shield, escape together with Mora, and survive. Sharana insisted that Gale and Mora should continue living even if she could not. Before she completely turned to stone, she made one final request. She asked Gale to look after everyone at the Smith's Guild on her behalf. Most of all, she hoped he would take care of Gimli. She admitted that Gimli had always done an excellent job leading the guild and regretted never telling her those words directly. Just before the petrification was completed, Gale suddenly asked Sharana to wait a moment. He reached out and cast his dispelling magic. Brilliant light surrounded Sharana's body, and the stone covering her gradually disappeared. Within moments, she had completely returned to normal. Sharona stared at her own hands in complete confusion, unable to understand what had just happened. Gale explained that when he had touched her during the petrification, he had somehow felt that his dispelling magic might be capable of removing the curse. Since he sensed the possibility, he had simply tried it, and fortunately it had worked. Neither Mora nor Sharona could find any words. Gale continued explaining his reasoning. At first, he had believed that a cockatrice's breath functioned as a poisonous attack. However, after examining it more closely, he realized it behaved much more like the petrification curse used by a gorgon. A gorgon was a female monster with snakes for hair whose gaze inflicted overwhelming fear, leaving victims trapped inside a petrification curse. Because of that similarity, Gale concluded that curses were not limited to undead or demonic creatures alone. Apparently, some forms of curse magic also affected animal-type monsters. This discovery opened entirely new possibilities for his craft. Looking back, treating petrification as ordinary poison had always seemed somewhat strange to him. Sharona suddenly noticed something unusual about the giant rooster. Although she herself was exhausted, the cockatrice appeared equally drained. Its comb hung limply over its head, suggesting that repeatedly using petrifying breath required tremendous energy. Mora quickly realized the significance of Gale's discovery. If Gale could simply dispel petrification, then the cockatrice's greatest weapon was no longer an overwhelming threat. The battle had completely turned in their favor. She announced that they should finish the monster before it recovered enough strength to use its breath again. Although her magical reserves were nearly depleted, Mora had regained enough energy to cast one final enhancement spell. She chose to strengthen Sharona once more. Sharona eagerly accepted the boost. Mora quickly outlined their plan. Sharona would occupy the snake and pin it down, while Gale attacked the cockatrice directly with his cursed equipment. Without hesitation, both of them rushed forward. The snake hissed furiously as Sharona charged straight into its open jaws, keeping its attention fixed entirely on herself. As they fought according to Mora's strategy, Sharona admired how clever the plan was. The rooster had expected its devastating surprise attack and petrifying breath to guarantee victory. It had never imagined that its strongest weapon would become completely useless. Taking advantage of the distraction, Gale sprinted around behind the cockatrice. Sharona shouted for him not to hesitate. Gale quietly declared that the rooster would soon be going back to sleep forever. Standing directly behind the monster, Gale activated every cursed tool he still possessed. He unleashed curse after curse in rapid succession, including poison, petrification, confusion, armor reduction, blood absorption, tearing, pain, binding, and countless others. Unsure which curses would actually affect a boss-class monster, he decided to use everything at once. Calling it the greatest clearance sale imaginable, he released a point-blank barrage of cursed attacks. Mora hurried back toward Sharona just before Gale leaped away. A tremendous explosion erupted beneath the cockatrice. Gale casually remarked that the bird could keep the change as the explosion consumed it. Immediately afterward, enormous numbers of cursed skulls burst into existence, completely burying the gigantic rooster beneath them. Skulls covered the battlefield in every direction. Staring in disbelief, Mora asked Gale whether he had truly used every single curse he possessed. Gale admitted that he had. Since he did not know which ones would work against a boss-class enemy, he had simply activated them all. A strange light soon began shining from beneath the mountain of cursed skulls. Horrified, Mora called Gale a complete fool. If every one of his curses had been activated simultaneously, she feared the entire world might be destroyed. Gale laughed awkwardly, insisting that she was exaggerating. However, brilliant rays of light continued bursting from beneath the skulls. Even Sharona admitted that although she had told Gale not to hold back, this had gone far beyond anything she had expected. An instant later, an enormous explosion erupted. A blinding flash consumed the battlefield before the blast waved violently through Gale, Sharona, and Mora through the cavern. Sharona screamed at Gale as blood rained down upon them. The cockatrice had exploded so completely that pieces of its body were scattered throughout the cave. Every one of them was drenched in blood. After the explosion, Sharona immediately asked Mora whether she had survived. Mora answered that she was barely alive. She complained that her entire body smelled terrible, her clothes were soaked with blood, and she would probably need a brand new cloak because those stains would never come out. Looking around, Mora asked where Gale had gone. Sharona spotted him lying unconscious nearby. Before anyone could relax, the entire mine began rumbling violently. Gale slowly opened his eyes and noticed the shaking ground. He wondered whether the mine was collapsing. Both Sharona and Mora immediately blamed him, insisting that the collapse was entirely his fault. Without wasting another second, all three sprinted toward the entrance. Massive rocks crashed down around them as the tunnels collapsed one after another. They raced back through the chamber filled with the petrified adventurers before finally reaching the exit. Just as enormous boulders sealed off the mine behind them, the three managed to escape outside. Exhausted, Gale and Mora collapsed onto the ground, relieved that they had survived. Their brief moment of relief ended when Sharona marched over and struck both of them on the head. Furious, she demanded to know why they had destroyed an entire mountain. Their objective had been to eliminate the monsters, not obliterate the mine itself. Gale argued that destroying the mine still technically meant they had completed the quest. Mora agreed, pointing out that every monster inside had indeed been defeated, so they should still qualify for a reward. Sharona trembled with anger. She demanded to know who would possibly reward adventurers for destroying the very mine they had been hired to protect. If anything, they were the ones who now owed compensation. Gale complained that Sharona was being unfair. He reminded her that she had promised to help him secure a better stall location through the Merchants Guild. After risking his life throughout the quest, he refused to let her back out of the agreement. Sharona immediately protested that she had taken the greatest risks of all. She had literally used her own body as a shield against the cockatrice's petrifying breath. Unable to contain her frustration any longer, Sharona ordered both of them to be quiet. She wondered how she was ever supposed to introduce Gale to the merchants now. Instead of presenting him as a talented craftsman, she would have to introduce him as the local man who destroyed an entire mine. Thanks to his cursed equipment, she had fought in bizarre armor, lost her treasured hammer, and watched the whole mountain explode. In her opinion, it had become the worst day of her life. Gale responded that she was being far too unreasonable. Sharona simply shouted at him to be quiet once again. Not far away, a hand suddenly emerged from the ground, followed by someone coughing as they pulled themselves free from the debris. The mysterious observer admitted that she had believed she was going to die. She reflected that Gale, the cursed crafter, had surpassed every expectation she had held. Her original plan had been to secretly follow him from a safe distance. But after witnessing him completely destroy an entire mine, she realized that even hiding far away had not been enough to escape the consequences of his actions. What she had witnessed exceeded anything she could have imagined. She decided to consider the matter settled between them. Although Gale claimed he could create nothing except cursed items, every single one of those creations possessed abilities worthy of artifact-class treasures. At last, she truly understood the extraordinary value of Gale's craftsmanship. In Chapter 17.5, the group later returned to Doghowl Mine to rescue the adventurers who had been turned to stone. Gale approached the very first statue they had encountered when they initially entered the mine, a man who had been petrified by the cockatrice. He cast his dispelling magic, and cracks immediately spread across the stone covering the man's body before the petrification completely broke away, restoring him to normal. They continued freeing the remaining victims one by one. Among them was a woman who, upon being restored, became overjoyed when she saw Charlie waiting for her. She was Penelope. Charlie was astonished to find her alive and immediately asked why she had been inside the mine. She had disappeared during the expedition, and he had feared the worst until these adventurers brought him there to rescue her. Overcome with emotion, Penelope threw her arms around Charlie and burst into tears. Watching the emotional reunion, Sharona jokingly remarked that the atmosphere between the two of them had become even hotter than the fires inside a forge. Meanwhile, Mora reminded everyone that they still needed to restore the mine and rescue the rest of the petrified adventurers. Charlie sincerely thanked Gale, Sharona, and Mora for saving Penelope and everyone else. He revealed that before setting out on the quest, he had promised Penelope that if they both survived, they would get married. Hearing that, Gale reached into his pocket and offered them one of his crafted items as a wedding gift, insisting that they did not need to repay him for it. The couple looked at him in surprise. Gale simply asked them to stop by his market stall sometime later. Before the couple could accept the gift, Sharona quickly interrupted and told Gale to stop giving cursed items as presents for important occasions like weddings. Mora agreed, pointing out that whether the gift was free or not made no difference if it was cursed. Although the couple was surprised by the reactions of the others, they simply smiled warmly, grateful to be alive and reunited once again. Back at the Travelers Guild, Gimli cheerfully welcomed whoever had entered through the door. However, her excitement immediately faded when she realized it was Sharona. Sharona jokingly pointed out that Gimli clearly seemed less happy now that she knew who had arrived. Sitting down in front of the counter, Sharona remarked that the guild was as empty as ever. Gimli teasingly asked whether Sharona had come looking for another argument. Sharona replied with a grin that if Gimli wanted one, she only had to say so. Instead of answering, Gimli picked up one of Gale's cursed darts and asked what exactly it was supposed to be. Sharna simply told her to examine it. As soon as Gimli inspected the item, her expression changed completely. She was stunned by what she sensed. Sharna smiled knowingly and explained that the dart was unquestionably an artifact class item. Gimli admitted that she had originally assumed it was some kind of joke, but after examining it herself, she could no longer deny it. Sharna explained that every one of those unbelievable items had been made by Gale himself. Even more unbelievable was the fact that Gale casually sold such treasures as though they were ordinary discounted merchandise. Sharna wondered what kind of person could possibly behave like that. Gimli smiled and replied that all she had heard was that Gale was an adventurer who had wandered into town from the capital. Rumors even suggested that he had once belonged to an S-rank adventuring party. Sharna stared at her in disbelief. She argued that someone like Gale could not possibly have wandered into a quiet little town like Farmage by coincidence. She then changed the subject to the adventurers who had been petrified inside Doghowl Mine. Every one of the survivors had been restored to normal. Gimli asked about the petrification itself. Sharna explained that even she had been turned into stone by the cockatrice, yet Gale had completely restored her. Now that the mine was operating again, workers kept discovering more petrified adventurers hidden in its deeper tunnels. Sadly, not everyone had survived. Some had already been partially eaten by the cockatrice before they could be rescued. However, everyone Gale had managed to restore was now recovering inside the town's only church infirmary. Sharna explained that the church clergy were completely bewildered by what had happened. They could not understand how the victims had been cured. Although Sharna had managed to smooth things over for the time being, Gale's dispelling abilities were simply too extraordinary to ignore. Curious, Gimli asked exactly what Sharna meant. Sharna explained that Gale's dispelling magic far surpassed ordinary dispel enchantments. He had somehow recognized that the cockatrice's petrification was actually a curse. Immediately afterward, he had simply dispelled the curse from every victim without using medicine or relying on the church's sacred facilities. Scratching her head, Sharna asked whether Gimli still intended to insist that Gale was merely a wandering adventurer. Gimli laughed softly before admitting that Gale was still technically a newcomer to the guild. Nevertheless, after seeing him rescue so many adventurers and solve several long-forgotten cold case quests, she believed it was time to recommend him for a promotion in rank, regardless of whether he usually worked alone. Sharna remarked that Gimli always behaved like a sly fox. Gimli replied that Sharna hardly needed someone to point that out. Gimli then asked what Sharna herself planned to do regarding Gale. After thinking for a moment, Sharna admitted that Gale had already joined the Smiths Guild as one of its members. Although Gale's artistic sense remained questionable, his actual craftsmanship was beyond dispute. Gimli agreed completely. There was no rule preventing someone from belonging to multiple guilds simultaneously. The two women exchanged satisfied smiles before quickly looking away. Sharna hurriedly announced that she needed to leave. Gimli immediately replied that Sharna was not actually sorry at all. Sharna simply told her to be quiet before walking away. Meanwhile, back at Doghowl Mine, Gale suddenly sneezed. Mora complained that he should at least turn his head before doing that. Gale apologized, explaining that the mine remained incredibly dusty. Looking around at the reconstruction work, Gale remarked that Sharna certainly worked her laborers hard. Mora replied that, considering everything that had happened, they should probably consider themselves lucky if Sharna forgave them after this. Gale commented that Mora remained surprisingly optimistic. Mora replied that the entire disaster had been caused by Gale unleashing every one of his curses simultaneously. She admitted that she genuinely could not decide whether he was a heroic adventurer who rescued people or a villain responsible for collapsing an entire mine. While speaking, she playfully squeezed his face. Nearby, miners continued loading carts full of rubble as the restoration work progressed. Mora then mentioned that she had heard Gale officially join the Smiths Guild. Gale confirmed it and proudly showed her his guild identification tags. One represented the Adventurers Guild, while the other belonged to the Smiths Guild. Mora found the situation quite unusual. The Smiths Guild consisted almost entirely of lifelong craftsmen. They normally refused to accept ordinary adventurers as members and even outsourced much of their mining work. Curious, she asked what responsibilities the guild had assigned to Gale. Gale answered that they had not given him any particular duties. They had simply allowed him to use one corner of the guild building as a workshop for creating cursed equipment. Mora wondered whether that meant the guild had truly accepted him as one of their own. Gale was unsure. He recalled that Sharna constantly complained about nearly everything he made, which he found somewhat annoying. According to Gale, Sharna disliked his habit of creating cursed swords and similar weapons. Assuming she preferred decorative items instead, he had recently begun crafting interior decorations. To demonstrate, Gale proudly presented one of his latest creations, a flower vase made by turning a polished human skull upside down. Mora recoiled in disgust. She could not believe Gale had placed flowers inside an upside-down skull and warned him never to carry something like that around in public. Gale protested that creating it had taken him an entire day. Mora sarcastically asked whether turning a skull upside down really required that much effort. Gale quickly clarified that the polishing alone had taken hours. He proudly pointed out the beautiful colors and glossy finish he had achieved. Mora insisted that no one should ever polish another person's skull so carefully. She also suspected that Gale had secretly filled it with ridiculous magical effects. Gale admitted that it possessed only modest abilities because he had focused primarily on the design. If placed inside a room, the skull vase continuously restored magical energy. It could also be used as a drinking cup, granting extremely rapid healing to whoever used it. Mora was left speechless. Such an item would be priceless to any mage. A magician's survival often depended upon recovering magical energy as quickly as possible, and this simple vase could accomplish exactly that. Gale seemed genuinely surprised by her reaction. From his perspective, anyone could simply sit down and recover magical energy naturally. Frustrated, Mora explained that recovering magical energy was not nearly so simple. Like physical stamina, magical recovery depended heavily upon proper nutrition, sufficient sleep, overall health, and even things such as sweets, alcohol, and other luxuries. Illness or poor physical condition could slow recovery dramatically. Because of that, mages were extremely careful about maintaining their bodies. Even then, when they urgently needed magical energy, they often resorted to foul-tasting potions or meditation inside completely dark rooms. None of those methods were pleasant. The realization that Gale's vase could replace all of that horrified her, imagining such a grotesque skull sitting inside her own bedroom. However, she admitted she could never actually bring herself to use it. At that moment, Sharana arrived and complained that everyone spent far too much time whining. She joked that if they continued shouting like this, they might cause another cave-in. Curious, Sharana asked what had happened. Gale explained that Mora became upset after seeing one of his prototypes. Sharana glanced at the skull vase only once before immediately declaring that she would personally throw Gale out of town if he ever attempted to sell something like that. Gale reminded her that she had specifically told him to use his imagination freely. Sharana replied that she had never intended for him to create such creepy decorations. What she wanted were practical tools that everyone could actually use. She then handed Gale an enormous object. Looking at it, Gale realized it was the severed head of the cockatrice they had defeated. Sharana instructed Gale to deliver it to Gimli at the Adventurers Guild, explaining that the guild would pay a bounty for it. The rest of the monster's body had also been recovered during the excavation. Gale hesitated, pointing out that Sharana had done most of the fighting herself. Sharana dismissed the idea. She admitted that she had defeated the first cockatrice and its offspring, but the final giant rooster had ultimately been Gale's victory. She instructed him to divide the reward equally with Mora. Gale looked uncertain. Sharana laughed and warned him not to misunderstand her intentions. Suddenly, Gale remembered something else entirely. He pointed out that Sharana still had not fulfilled her promise to reward him. Sharana jokingly suggested that a simple thank you should be enough. Gale reminded her that he had only accepted the quest because she promised to help him obtain a proper shop. Sharana assured him she had not forgotten. The Smith's Guild was simply occupied rebuilding the mine Gale had destroyed. Once reconstruction finished, he could choose whatever kind of business he wanted, whether a market stall, a rental shop, or even an entire building. Excited, Gale immediately requested a real building. Sharana laughed and accused him of becoming greedy. Before discussing that further, she wanted to show him something. Nearby stood a large cart covered with a massive tarp. Sharana asked Gale whether he recognized what lay beneath it. When Gale uncovered it, he discovered the specialized organ responsible for producing the cockatrice's petrifying breath. Sharana explained that it was the organ that generated the substance capable of turning people into stone. Since Gale believed the ability functioned as a curse, she reminded him of that conclusion. Gale agreed. The sensation produced by the petrifying breath closely resembled the cursed petrification used by Gorgons. The fact that he had successfully dispelled the petrification affecting both Sharana and the rescued adventurers convinced him that the mechanism truly relied upon curse magic. Sharana smiled and declared that the organ now belonged to Gale. Since he enjoyed experimenting with cursed materials, she suggested he try crafting new equipment from it. Gale hesitated, pointing out that such a valuable organ would surely sell for an enormous amount of money. Sharana insisted that he simply accept it. Gale gratefully agreed. Sharana then added one final condition. Instead of giving away such valuable creations for free, Gale needed to learn the meaning of supply and demand. She intended to teach him exactly why everyone constantly complained about his terrible business sense. However, The people of Farmage were not the only ones astonished by Gale's cursed creations. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, inside its hidden vaults, a shocked voice exclaimed in disbelief after hearing that an artifact had appeared. Kneeling on the floor, Liznette calmly insisted there could be no doubt. Before she could explain further, Prince Virial violently grabbed her jaw. He declared that he expected excuses, not absurd lies. As the crown prince of the empire, he demanded to know whether she truly believed she could deceive him. She was nothing more than the leader of the Assassin's Guild. Liznette admitted that she had no excuse for her failure. Virial angrily seized her by the hair and dragged her across the floor. He called her completely incompetent. Despite boasting so confidently beforehand, she had failed her mission. Her supposedly elite assassins had accomplished nothing. Stopping before a sealed treasure chest, Virial ordered Liznette to look inside. Within the chest rested the Empire's most terrifying cursed artifact, known as the Heart of the Devil. It contained the core essence of a demon king who had once plunged the world into terror. The sinister miasma pouring from the chest horrified Liznette. Virial explained that the artifact literally drained the life force of anyone nearby. It had finally begun feeding again after a long period of inactivity, and it especially enjoyed consuming the lives of worthless failures like her. He forced Liznette's face toward the open chest before asking whether she understood why he had summoned her to such a dreadful place. Liznette quietly admitted that she did not know while desperately begging for forgiveness. Laughing coldly, Virial remarked that nobody would willingly enter such a room unless ordered to do so. Its deadly atmosphere made it the perfect location for secret meetings. He casually mentioned that a single touch from the heart of the devil could instantly kill an ordinary warrior. Liznette continued pleading for mercy. Finally, Virial closed the chest, released her, and announced that he would spare her for now. Instead, he demanded a complete explanation of every detail surrounding the failed assassination. Liznette immediately obeyed. She explained that everything had proceeded exactly according to plan until the decisive moment. Through their network of spies, the Assassin's Guild had successfully deployed elite operatives. However, Princess Kara had unexpectedly been protected by the artifact Liznette had previously reported. Every assassination technique they attempted had been completely nullified. Virial reacted with disbelief. He refused to believe that such a defenseless princess had effortlessly survived every assassination attempt. Liznette insisted that Kara's artifact granted complete resistance to instant death while possessing several additional unknown abilities. Although the claim sounded unbelievable, Liznette argued that no other explanation could account for the complete destruction of her assassination team. Virial slowly recognized the greater implications. If a neighboring kingdom possessed a previously unknown artifact, then the Empire's intelligence network had failed catastrophically. Artifacts represented priceless strategic assets. Properly used, even a single artifact could alter the balance of power between nations. Both the Empire and the neighboring kingdom carefully monitored every known artifact and its owner. How, then, had this one escaped their notice? Virial angrily concluded that the situation was unacceptable. Worse still, he suspected there were probably additional unknown artifacts as well. Liznette quietly agreed. Virial cursed the timing of the discovery. Kara herself meant little to him personally, but he absolutely could not allow his half-brother, the second prince, to marry her. Such a marriage would greatly strengthen his rival's political influence. Filled with frustration, Virial demanded to know where Kara had obtained such extraordinary artifacts. At that point, Liznette cautiously revealed one final piece of intelligence. According to the Assassin's Guild's investigation, the mysterious artifact protecting Princess Kara had been purchased from a certain young man who operated nothing more than a small market stall. At the start of Chapter 19, in a corner of a tavern in the capital that was popular among adventurers, someone loudly exclaimed that Gale was supposedly in Farmage and wondered how he had the nerve to travel that far. Melissa immediately told him he was speaking too loudly, while Norris warned Kush that someone might overhear them and make use of that information. Kush brought the conversation back to the main topic, explaining that the rumor had been circulating among the coachmen outside the city. He questioned whether it was really just a rumor and joked that perhaps Gale had hidden himself aboard a stagecoach. Before continuing, Kush called a waitress over. When she arrived, he demanded more ale, complaining that the refills were too slow. Although the waitress apologized, Kush ordered her to bring an entire barrel instead. She politely confirmed the order and hurried away. Norris quietly remarked that Kush had probably drunk enough for one night. Luke then explained what he had heard. According to the story, a stagecoach heading toward Farmage had been attacked by a horde of orcs, and Gale had supposedly defeated every one of them. The rumor also claimed that he had been accompanied by an exceptionally talented support mage. Kush immediately rejected the story. He argued that there was no way Gale could accomplish something like that. If someone with a rearguard class could defeat monsters on that scale, then there would be no point in organizing parties with proper frontline and rearline positions. Luke urged him to listen until the end before dismissing the story. He continued by explaining that witnesses described Gale carrying an ugly, worn-looking dagger, yet that single weapon had supposedly destroyed the entire horde. Luke suspected it had been one of Gale's cursed weapons, and to him, that sounded exactly like something Gale would create. Kush still refused to believe it. Even experienced adventurers struggled against orcs, so the idea that Gale could wipe out an entire horde sounded impossible. He concluded that the rumor had to be referring to someone else. Luke admitted that possibility, but encouraged everyone to consider the other reports as well. Melissa then shared an eyewitness account she had gathered. She confirmed that Kush had been right about one thing. Gale really had been operating a market stall. He had been selling cursed goods as interior decorations at unbelievably low prices. For reasons nobody understood, every item had eventually been confiscated by the royal guard. Kush laughed loudly. Since everyone already knew what Gale usually created, he assumed the goods had either been defective or had attracted endless complaints. Still, he admitted that Gale apparently managed to earn some money from selling what he jokingly called garbage. Norris added that the people he had questioned all claimed Gale appeared to be doing surprisingly well. Someone matching Gale's description had been staying at a respectable inn and had even purchased an entirely new set of clothes. Luke pointed out that Gale had clearly earned enough money to pay for stagecoach travel. Considering that the royal guard had been searching everywhere for him without success, perhaps Gale had already left the capital entirely. Melissa's information suggested he had made a considerable amount of money, and Gale would surely try to invest those earnings somehow. Kush asked where Luke was going with that line of thinking. Norris explained that when all the stories were combined, they suggested Gale may have deliberately relocated somewhere outside the capital. Given Gale's endlessly optimistic personality, it would not be surprising if he had decided to use his savings to establish a cursed goods shop in another town. Gale had always been creating bizarre items, so he certainly had enough merchandise to stock such a store. The others slowly began agreeing with the theory. Melissa added another important detail. An adventurer matching Gale's description had previously submitted paperwork to the Merchants Guild to establish a market stall. She had even shown the guild master the mission contract Princess Kara had given them. Although the guild master complained about revealing private information, he eventually admitted that the man had not been seen around the capital for quite some time. Luke concluded that Gale had probably gained enough experience running his first stall before deciding to continue his business elsewhere. Kush laughed, saying that regardless of whether Gale's strange products actually sold, Gale was exactly the kind of fool who would open an entire cursed goods shop if he had enough money. Looking down, Kush noticed his mug was empty again. He loudly complained about the slow service and demanded that his ale be brought immediately, casually announcing that Princess Kara would be paying the bill anyway. A shadow suddenly fell across their table. The waitress had returned, carrying 2 enormous barrels with one in each hand. Just as Kush prepared to complain again, the waitress slammed both barrels onto the table and sarcastically thanked him for his patience. Kush protested that customers should not be treated that way. The waitress calmly reminded him that those were exactly the barrels he had ordered. Norris stared in amazement, commenting that even lifting a single barrel required tremendous strength. As the group resumed discussing Gale's possible whereabouts, the waitress quietly continued listening. Nearby, another server whispered to her, praising her excellent work and addressing her as Liznette. Liznette quietly acknowledged the compliment. She reflected that her assignment involved monitoring the group and gathering intelligence, although she found it rather humiliating that she had to work part-time inside such a shabby tavern within the kingdom. The other operative asked whether they were certain they had identified the correct group. Liznette replied that she was almost certain. Everything matched their intelligence reports. Judging from their behavior, they were exactly as unpleasant as expected. Another operative remarked that it was difficult to believe Princess Kara had actually hired such people. Liznette pointed out that the conversation about farmage and the repeated mentions of Gale's name confirmed their identities. They were the famous S-rank adventuring party known as Wolfpack. At present, they were actively searching for a man named Gale Hamilton. According to their information, Princess Kara herself had become desperate to locate Gale because he was supposedly the creator of the mysterious artifact protecting her. One of the operatives wondered what kind of man Gale really was. An artifact creator powerful enough to attract the attention of an S-rank party seemed almost unbelievable. Liznette admitted she did not know, but she had already reached one conclusion. Gale was extraordinarily clever. He had once belonged to the same S-rank party, yet none of them had any idea where he had disappeared. Every investigation ended in a dead end. The only information they managed to uncover concerned his terrible artistic taste and the hideous appearance of his creations. To Liznette, those details seemed almost intentionally misleading, as though someone wanted to conceal the true identity of the artifact creator. She compared Gale to a ghost. No matter how thoroughly they investigated, they learned almost nothing about his past or his current activities. The realization irritated her deeply. Although they had gathered plenty of intelligence regarding Wolfpack, at least they now possessed a possible lead toward Gale's location. Once the party departed, Liznette intended to have her own agents secretly follow them. When Wolfpack eventually located Gale, Liznette planned to take him for herself. Filled with frustration, Liznette silently cursed Gale Hamilton with every ounce of hatred she possessed. Meanwhile, deep inside the Smiths Guild, the sound of heavy hammering echoed throughout the workshop. Mora quietly watched Gale forging another item. While working, Gale wondered aloud whether he should finally tell Mora something. Curious, Mora asked what he meant. Gale explained that he wanted to thank her properly for helping during the Doghowl Mine quest. She had no obligation to participate, yet she had willingly joined anyway. He sincerely admitted that having her beside him made him feel much more secure. Mora immediately blushed. In her mind, she recognized it as another one of Gale's completely straightforward remarks that always caught her off guard. Gale warmly shook her hand. Trying to hide her embarrassment, Mora proudly declared that she was one of the capital's 5 greatest support mages. There was no one she could not support effectively. Until Gale finally opened his dream shop in the better part of town, she intended to continue helping him. Gale gratefully agreed, explaining that thanks to her support, his dream was finally within reach. Hearing those words made Mora blush even more. She quietly suggested that perhaps she could continue supporting him even after that. Before Gale could answer, he suddenly sneezed. Mora immediately scolded him once again, reminding him to turn his head away whenever he sneezed. Apologizing, Gale wondered aloud why he had been sneezing so much lately. Perhaps people were constantly talking about him. At that moment, Sharona entered the workshop, suggesting that the mine dust was probably irritating his nose. Gale happily greeted her and thanked her again for lending him the workshop. Sharona looked over the item Gale had been working on and asked whether it was finally finished. Gale confirmed that he had built it according to her specifications, although he personally thought it looked rather plain. Sharona laughed and remarked that if Gale thought something looked plain, then ordinary people would probably love it. Completely confused, Gale asked what she meant by that. Sharona picked up the device and asked how it worked. Gale asked her to hand it back. After turning a small key, the device immediately activated. A beam shot forward. Gale calmly explained that it fired a petrification beam. Sharona instantly ducked out of the way, shouting that she had only asked how to operate it, not for Gale to point it directly at her and activate it. Gale explained that the device was powered by the cockatrice organ and projected a petrification curse. Sharona angrily demanded to know whether he was trying to turn her into stone all over again. Gale casually replied that he would simply dispel the curse afterward. He then wondered aloud whether anyone would actually want to buy such a thing. Sharona explained that this was exactly what she had meant when discussing supply and demand. She reminded Gale to look around Farmage. The region consisted mainly of plains, mountains, and forests. Although rocks existed, usable construction stone remained surprisingly scarce. Using the desert as an example, she explained that building stone structures required enormous effort. People could manufacture bricks from sand, dig stone from the ground, or transport it over long distances, but every method was costly or impractical. Gale agreed with that assessment. Mora added that producing durable bricks required valuable water, which was extremely scarce in desert regions. Sharona then pointed directly at Gale's petrification device. She asked them to imagine having such a tool. Gale immediately understood. By packing sand into molds and firing the petrification beam, they could instantly transform the sand into solid stone bricks. Mora quickly realized the practical application as well. Sharona smiled and told Gale that while his craftsmanship was exceptional, he had absolutely no understanding of how people could actually use his inventions. Embarrassed by the compliment, Gale quietly blushed. Sharona continued explaining that Farmage constantly struggled with shortages of quality stone. Although the town could mine or transport stone, obtaining enough high-quality material remained difficult. Gale's invention could solve that entire problem. If it proved useful, he could earn an enormous fortune from it. Gale found that difficult to believe. Sharona firmly insisted that she had already told him countless times that he possessed tremendous talent and genuine skill, but absolutely no business sense. Gale protested that he certainly did. Mora quietly added that he also had no ability to read the atmosphere around him. Sharona admitted that although she had never been particularly interested in cursed items before, she genuinely found Gale's creations fascinating. Hearing that sincere praise, Gale smiled shyly. Sharona laughed at how easily he could be pleased. Nevertheless, she reminded him that they still had enough cockatrice materials to produce another petrification device. She asked whether he could build another one, but warned him not to include any unnecessary gimmicks this time. She also wondered whether the baby cockatrices could be used as crafting materials. Gale shook his head. He had already examined several of them, but their petrification organs had not fully developed. Their snake tails did contain venom, but unlike the adults, their poison was completely unrelated to curses. Sharona remarked that a machine capable of producing venom would still be extremely useful, although she understood they could not expect everything. Gale looked puzzled and asked whether such a device would really have practical value. Sharona reminded him that Farmage was an agricultural town constantly plagued by harmful insects and wild animals. The right poison could eliminate pests and even assist hunters. She suspected Gale had no idea how valuable effective poisons could be. To her surprise, Gale calmly replied that he could easily make such items if she wanted them. Sharona stared at him in disbelief. Gale explained that producing poison talismans was fairly simple with the proper materials. He had made them regularly before. Still doubtful, Sharona asked what ingredients he would require. Gale listed several examples, including ghoul stomachs, venom glands, mummy wrappings, and even zombie clothing, all of which could be transformed into poison talismans. Sharona pointed out that none of those materials were exactly easy to obtain. Gale admitted that merchants rarely sold them, so he usually collected everything himself. After hearing that, Sharona laughed. At this point, she believed Gale probably could accomplish almost anything. Excited by the possibilities, she decided to ask Gimli to help gather whatever materials Gale needed. She also suggested that Gale simply create whatever he wanted from those materials because she intended to purchase everything at a fair price. Gale immediately offered her a prototype rotten perfume bottle. The moment the girls opened it, an unbearable stench filled the room. Sharona stared at him in disbelief and demanded to know whether he had used zombie intestines. Gale calmly corrected her, explaining that they actually belonged to a ghoul. Mora sighed, certain that the bottle was probably filled with incredible magical effects as well. She decided not to ask. Sharona firmly instructed Gale to make only the items she specifically requested and absolutely nothing else, emphasizing her point by slapping a stack of design papers into his hands. Gale blushed with excitement at the sight of the new designs and happily announced that he would begin working on one immediately. Sharona smiled, saying she looked forward to seeing the results. She picked up the cockatrice organ, explaining that she wanted to study it more closely first. Gale agreed without hesitation. Mora volunteered to accompany Sharona, since carrying such a large object would make opening doors rather difficult. Sharona teasingly asked why Mora was still hanging around Gale. Smiling awkwardly, Mora admitted that there simply were not any suitable quests available for her that day, so she thought she might spend a little more time checking on Gale. Sharona laughed and admitted she had only been teasing. She had heard that Gale and Mora had been completing quests together as a temporary party. Even Gimli was pleased that many of her long unsolved quests were finally disappearing. Watching the two work together, Sharona quietly reflected that if Gale and Mora eventually found themselves happy living in Farmage, she truly could not ask for anything more. At the start of Chapter 20, loud laughter echoed throughout a carriage as it traveled toward Farmage. Kush boasted that royalty certainly did not hold back when it came to spending money. He proudly admired the mithril sword he had purchased for 500 gold coins. Melissa had chosen a blade crafted from a wyvern's bone, while Norris proudly showed off his new magic staff and spellbook, boasting that he could now cast powerful spells more rapidly than before. Luke had also purchased armor made from magical beast hide. Kush laughed, saying that it did not matter whether Gale had cursed them or not. With equipment like this, their party could finally unleash its true strength, and no one would be able to stand against them. As everyone laughed together, Kush suddenly complained that despite being an S-rank party, no skilled support members had come looking to join them. Norris reminded him that there were very few adventurers capable of keeping up with an S-rank team. Luke agreed, saying that was why they had previously settled for companions like Gale and Mora. Nearby passengers quietly whispered among themselves, remarking that hardly anyone would willingly tolerate people with personalities like theirs. Kush declared that money solved problems like these. He then called over one of the hooded travelers accompanying them and referred to her as the gloomy girl. The hooded woman lowered her hood, revealing herself to be Liznette. Smiling politely, she explained that her group's assignment was to provide temporary support by applying item buffs and debuffs for the Wolfpack party while also carrying their equipment. Kush replied that this was exactly why they had hired them. Since Liznette's group had been too poor to travel to Farmage on their own, he claimed his party had generously decided to help them. Although Liznette laughed outwardly, inwardly she swore she would eventually kill him. One of her subordinates quietly reminded her to remain patient until they located the artifact creator. Liznette admitted that, despite everything, traveling alongside the Wolfpack gave them the ideal opportunity to monitor the party closely. Another subordinate commented that Kush had not been wrong about how poor they were. Secretly, Liznette seethed with anger, imagining the day she would crush every member of the party. Melissa suggested they spend the rest of the trip eating, drinking, and enjoying themselves until they reached Farmage. Kush ordered Liznette to bring over their supplies. After spreading expensive food and fine wine across the table, he proudly announced that Princess Kara was paying for everything. Another member commented that, besides the luxury, they would also get to enjoy the beautiful scenery on the journey toward the kingdom's farming region. Liznette cautiously reminded them that they had accepted an escort mission for the caravan and that drinking too much could interfere with their duties. Kush immediately silenced her, complaining that simply seeing her gloomy expression ruined the taste of his wine. He mockingly told her to cover herself with a tarp like the rest of her companions. As the wolf pack continued laughing loudly, Liznette quietly discussed their financial problems with her subordinates, listing lodging costs, intelligence gathering, communication with the Empire, and countless ongoing expenses. One subordinate remarked that Kush's party had no intention of sharing any of their own wealth. At least, they noted, the tavern had provided them with free meals. Suddenly, an incredibly loud screech echoed across the countryside. Every member of Liznette's group immediately froze. Outside, the caravan guards shouted warnings that monsters had appeared. Mercenaries quickly formed battle lines while adventurers rushed to defend the wagons. Confused voices demanded to know where the enemy was until everyone turned toward the forest, where countless monsters emerged. The mercenaries encouraged everyone not to panic, reminding them that after the previous orc attack, they had reinforced the caravan's defenses with additional guards. However, the monster horde charged without hesitation, sending the lead wagon flying into the air. Another scout soon reported that they had identified the leader of the horde. It was a behemoth, an S-rank monster usually found near the border between the Empire and the Kingdom. Liznette quickly instructed her subordinates that they had been trained to fight people rather than monsters. Facing creatures like these directly would likely end in defeat. She observed killer wolves, grand boars, red grizzlies, and numerous other monsters, each ranked B or higher. One subordinate asked whether they should retreat immediately. Looking back, Liznette saw that Kush's party remained completely unaware of the danger as they continued drinking and laughing inside the carriage. She realized this was the moment to either flee or act. However, her mission depended entirely on keeping track of Kush's party. Frustrated, she ordered her followers to prepare for an emergency retreat while engaging the monsters for as long as possible. She wondered why the Empire's monster hunting mission had failed to eliminate the behemoth. One subordinate explained that the kingdom had also issued a similar quest, but the S-rank party assigned to it had abruptly canceled. Liznette stared in disbelief before suddenly connecting the pieces. An idiotic S-rank party. She slowly turned toward Kush's group. One subordinate asked what they should do about them. Liznette replied that, despite their behavior, an S-rank party should still be capable of fighting a behemoth. Since they were technically allies at the moment, she intended to force them into battle if necessary. Soon afterward, a loud warning reached Kush's party announcing that the caravan was under attack by a behemoth. Luke noticed that Liznette's group had already disappeared. Pretending to panic, Liznette cried out dramatically, but Kush simply shouted at her to stop whining. Luke remarked that things outside had suddenly become noisy. Norris realized that the wagon had completely stopped moving. When they looked outside, they discovered the driver was gone. A massive mouth suddenly opened directly in front of the carriage. Norris and Luke froze in terror. Liznette recalled the earlier discussion about the orc attack. Those orcs had been driven from their nests by this very same behemoth, forcing them onto the highway where they attacked passing travelers. That alone demonstrated how overwhelming the creature's strength truly was. The caravan shook violently, throwing everyone inside to the floor. Liznette and her subordinates immediately leaped outside, landing gracefully on their feet, while Kush's party stumbled helplessly across the carriage floor. She sarcastically remarked that an S-rank party should at least know how to brace themselves against a charge. The behemoth let out a deafening roar that seemed to shake the air itself. Liznette instinctively trembled before the monster's overwhelming presence. Meanwhile, Kush stared at the enormous beast in disbelief, wondering what exactly it was. Melissa questioned whether it resembled a giant boar, a rhinoceros, or perhaps some kind of enormous cow. Norris observed that the monster was an unbelievable mass of muscle, while somehow remaining astonishingly agile. Luke could only shiver alongside him. Liznette finally shouted that it was obviously a behemoth, the very monster they had supposedly come to defeat. Kush's party stared in complete shock. Luke admitted he had no idea how Liznette recognized it, but accepted that it truly was a behemoth. Norris forced out a laugh, insisting that although it was larger than expected, it was still no match for them. Around them, frightened travelers began pointing toward the wolf pack, encouraging one another after recognizing the famous S-rank party. The cheering noticeably lifted morale throughout the caravan. One of Liznet's subordinates admired how quickly the crowd regained confidence, while another suggested preparing support items for the party. The behemoth suddenly charged. The wolf pack proudly declared that the monster was about to face the combined might of the strongest adventuring party in the capital. Liznet watched with excitement, eager to witness the true power of an S-rank team. Instead, the behemoth casually swept its enormous tail through the group, sending every member of the wolf pack flying in an instant. The mercenaries, the travelers, Liznet's subordinates, and even Liznet herself stood frozen in disbelief. Speechless, Liznet questioned whether that was truly the full strength of an S-rank party. The behemoth slowly turned its attention toward everyone else. Panic immediately spread through the caravan as people fled toward the forest. Liznet cursed under her breath. They could not allow the wolf pack to be wiped out here. One subordinate reminded her that they still had prepared escape routes. Liznet thought of Prince Virial and rejected the idea of abandoning the mission. Refusing to retreat, she gripped her dagger tightly and reminded herself that they were the Empire's finest assassins. She ordered every subordinate to draw their weapons. Although she hated the situation, they would defeat the monsters themselves while secretly protecting the wolf pack without revealing their true identities. A monster's claw slashed toward her, but she narrowly avoided the attack. Declaring that she would personally face the behemoth, she instructed one of her subordinates to prepare the necessary support. Her subordinate wished her good luck and prayed that they would all survive. The behemoth roared once more. Using the cover of the surrounding forest, Liznet silently leaped high above the monster before striking directly at one of its blind spots. To her surprise, the behemoth detected the attack and effortlessly avoided it. Realizing that ordinary stealth would not work against an S-rank monster with such extraordinary senses, she immediately switched tactics. Her wyvern-forged dagger carried a deadly, instantaneous poison that should have been sufficient to kill almost anything. She launched herself toward the behemoth, kicking off its body before attempting to tear open its throat with her second strike. Although she achieved the perfect angle, her blade failed to penetrate its incredibly tough hide. Quickly retreating, Liznet concluded that if she could not cut its throat, then she would simply destroy its eye instead. Her dagger pierced the creature's eye, coating the wound with powerful poison. Confidently, she mocked the behemoth, asking how it felt to lose an eye to a poison blade while waiting for the toxin to spread throughout its body. To her astonishment, the monster continued moving as though nothing had happened. The behemoth then exhaled a strange cloud toward her. At first she assumed it was poison mist, but she quickly realized the horrifying truth. The monster possessed poison resistance. Seeing no other option, Liznet reluctantly decided to use her final trump card. She reached for a fragment of the heart of the devil, the forbidden cursed relic Prince Virial had entrusted to her. She remembered his words, that by accepting the heart's power, it would become her blood, her muscles, and the source of overwhelming strength. In return, she herself would become the vessel desired by the heart of the devil.